Amelia Carter tore the note in half with trembling hands, right there on the platform in front of every watching eye in Red Willow, Montana. She did not cry. She did not beg. She pressed the two pieces against her chest, breathed once, and lifted her chin. 7 years of letters. 7 years of promises. Ended in 11 words written by a man who hadn't even come to deliver them himself. If you've ever been left behind by someone who never deserved you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 arrived in Red Willow, Montana, the way most things did in that part of the territory, without warning and without mercy. The afternoon train from Billings pulled into the station carrying 23 passengers, 4 crates of dry goods, 2 cages of chickens that hadn't stopped screaming since dawn, and one woman who had traveled across 4 states carrying everything she owned in 2 heavy trunks, and a heart so full of hope it hadn't yet learned to brace for what was coming. Her name was Amelia Carter. She was 27 years old. She was a beautiful, plus-size woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with dark chestnut hair pinned carefully beneath a traveling hat that had seen better days, and warm brown eyes that took in a room the way her father had taught her, slowly, quietly, missing nothing. She stepped off that train in her best dress, the one she'd pressed twice the night before in a boarding house outside Billings, and she stood on the platform with her 2 trunks at her feet and looked out at the faces of Red Willow, Montana, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had traveled a very long way and had no intention of arriving with anything less than her full self. She was waiting for Ethan Caldwell. She had been waiting for Ethan Caldwell in one way or another for 7 years. They had met when she was barely 20, when her father's horse operation in Salina, Kansas, had done business with the Caldwell family for a single season. Ethan had been charming in the way that certain men are charming, all surface and easy words, the kind of man who made a woman feel chosen simply by directing his attention at her. He had written her first. She'd kept that letter in a cedar box on her windowsill until the wood of the box faded and the paper inside turned soft at the folds. For 7 years, those letters had come. Not every week. Sometimes months would pass, and she would sit with the quiet of his silence, like something heavy across her shoulders, wondering. But then the envelope would arrive, his handwriting slanted and sure across the front, and the wondering would quiet itself, because here was proof, here was the man, here was his regard for her, here was the future assembling itself, one letter at a time. When he finally wrote asking her to come to Montana, to come as his wife, she had read that letter 4 times, sitting at the kitchen table, before she allowed herself to believe it. Her father, Thomas Carter, had read it over her shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. "You sure about this man, Amelia?" he'd finally said. "I've known him 7 years, Papa." "You've known his letters 7 years," Thomas said. "That ain't always the same thing." She had kissed her father's cheek and told him not to worry. She thought about that now. Standing on the platform, with her trunks and her pressed dress and her 7 years of letters, she thought about her father's careful words and felt the first cold thread of understanding begin to unwind somewhere beneath her sternum, because Ethan Caldwell was not at the station. She looked the length of the platform twice, then again. Porters moved luggage. A family reunited near the far end, a woman crying into her husband's collar. 2 cowboys leaned against the station wall, trading words she couldn't hear. A dog slept in a patch of sun near the ticket window. No Ethan. She found the station master and asked politely whether a Mr. Ethan Caldwell had left any message for her. The station master, a narrow-shouldered man with a gray mustache, looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the particular kind of appraisal that moved over a woman's body, like an inventory. Noting size, noting presentation, noting whether or not she matched someone's expectation. "You Miss Carter," he said. "I am." He reached beneath the counter without another word and produced an envelope. She opened it right there at the window, which was her first mistake, because the station master did not step away, and she later understood that he read every word along with her. The note was brief, not even a full page. Ethan's handwriting slanted and sure as it always was, but the words beneath it were something she had never once imagined receiving from this man. "Miss Carter, the arrangement has been reconsidered. It would be best if you did not come to the ranch. I trust you will understand that circumstances change. I wish you well. E. Caldwell. She read it once. Then she read it again. The third time she read it, she became aware that her hands were not entirely steady, and that the station master had taken a small, deliberate step backward, the way people do when they are trying to look like they haven't been watching. Amelia folded the note. She folded it along its existing crease precisely, then folded it again into quarters. She placed it in her coat pocket. She thanked the station master for his assistance, and turned around and walked back to her trunks, and stood beside them, and looked out at the town of Red Willow, Montana, for a long, quiet moment. She did not cry. She wanted to. The pressure behind her eyes was considerable, and there was a sensation in her chest that she recognized as the beginning of something that, if she gave it room, would take her completely apart on this platform in front of every soul in Red Willow. She recognized it, and she chose deliberately not to. Because her father had also taught her this: a woman who falls apart in public in a town she doesn't know is a woman those people will never forget for all the wrong reasons. So she breathed. She thought about what she had. 2 trunks. A small amount of money, not much. She'd spent the majority on travel. Her father's name and reputation meant nothing out here. She knew no one. She had no return ticket. She had a handmade wedding dress folded between 2 layers of muslin in the bottom of the second trunk. But a wedding dress in Red Willow, Montana with no groom was about as useful as a saddle with no horse. What she had, Amelia reminded herself, was herself, and she had been enough before. She would be enough now. The whispers started within the hour. Red Willow was not a large town, and news of the kind that had arrived on the afternoon train traveled the way. News always travels in small places, fast and altered slightly with each telling. By the time Amelia had arranged for her trunks to be stored at the station, and had walked the length of the main street to assess what work the town might offer a woman willing to work, she had become, in the collective imagination of Red Willow, a cautionary tale. She felt the eyes. She heard the voices that dropped when she passed, and lifted again when she was just past the range of ordinary courtesy. Outside the dry goods store, 2 women her mother's age looked at her, and then looked at each other with the precise, coordinated judgment of people who have been practicing this particular art for decades. "That's the woman from the train," the taller one said, not quietly enough. "The one Caldwell sent the note to." "Lord," said the other. "You think she really expected him to marry her?" The taller one said nothing further. She didn't need to. The silence she offered in response contained everything the words hadn't said. Amelia kept walking. She asked at the hotel about laundry work. The woman at the desk pleasant enough until she got a full look at Amelia and reconsidered something behind her eyes, said they had no positions available. She asked at the bakery. The baker said he wasn't hiring. She asked at the seamstress's shop, where she had genuine skill to offer. She had been sewing since she was 8 years old and had made her own wedding dress without a pattern. And the seamstress, a bird-like woman with quick hands, had looked her up and down and said the shop was too small for additional staff. By evening, Amelia had been declined 6 times, eaten the last of the food she'd brought for the train journey, and was sitting on the bench outside the station, doing the mathematics of her situation, with the focused calm of someone who has decided that panicking is a luxury she cannot afford. It was there that she overheard the conversation that changed everything. 2 cowboys were talking near the hitching post, not particularly concerned about whether anyone could hear them, the way men in working clothes often aren't. "You hear Hayes is still fighting with that black devil," the first one said. "Shadow." The second man shook his head. "He's had 3 handlers quit on him in 2 months. That horse is going to kill somebody before it's over. Hayes is a stubborn one. Won't put the animal down. Can't afford to. That stallion is worth more than the whole rest of his stock combined, if anybody could ever get near him long enough to prove it. But nobody can. That horse doesn't trust anybody breathing. Hayes ought to just sell the debt and walk away. Whitmore's been after that land for years. Hayes won't sell. You know how he is." The first cowboy laughed low and without much humor in it. "Yeah, I know how he is. Proud as that damn horse and twice as hard to reach." They moved off toward the saloon, leaving Amelia sitting in the cooling evening air with her hands folded in her lap, and something shifting inside her chest that was neither hope nor certainty, but was something very close to recognition. She knew about horses that didn't trust anyone. She had grown up with them. Her father, Thomas Carter, had built his reputation in Salina on exactly this, on the horses that other men gave up on. The ones labeled dangerous, labeled unmanageable, labeled a waste of good feed and a risk to life and limb. Thomas Carter had taken those horses and spent however long it took, learning what was underneath the fear and the violence. And more often than not, he had found the same thing. An animal that had been hurt by humans and had made the very reasonable decision that the safest response to humans was aggression. You can't force trust. Her father had told her when she was 9 years old, sitting on the fence rail watching him work a scarred gray mare that had been abused by her previous owner. You can pretend at it. You can make an animal behave like it trusts you by putting enough pressure on it. But that ain't trust. That's just a different kind of fear wearing a trained face. Real trust. Amelia, real trust has to be chosen, and the animal has to be the one who chooses. She had sat on that fence rail and watched her father work, and she had never forgotten the lesson. Now, sitting outside a train station in a town that had already decided what she was worth, she thought about a black stallion named Shadow and a rancher named Hayes, who was too proud to give up on something everyone else had already written off. She thought, I understand that. In the morning, she asked at the general store where the Hayes Ranch was located. The man behind the counter, older, weathered, not unkind, told her it was roughly 11 miles northeast up toward the foothills, and then looked at her with the careful expression of someone choosing whether to say the next part. You looking for work out there, ma'am? He said. I am. He scratched his jaw. Hayes is a fair man, but that ranch has got trouble right now. That horse. I heard, she said. You heard, and you're still heading out there. I am. He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Hayes will be the one to decide, he said. But you might mention to him that Bill Greer at the general store said you seemed like a woman who meant what she said. That counts for something with Nathan Hayes. She thanked him. She arranged with the station master to leave one trunk in storage, paid for 3 days with the last coins she felt comfortable parting with. And at first light. The next morning, she began the 11-mile walk northeast toward the Hayes Ranch with her remaining trunk, her father's training in her hands, and absolutely nothing left to lose. She arrived at mid-morning. The Hayes Ranch was visible from a distance, the way working ranches tend to be, not by any single dramatic feature, but by the accumulation of function, the fences extending outward in organized lines, the barn rising against the foothills with the particular solidity of a building built to last, the horses moving in the paddocks with the easy rhythm of animals that were well kept and knew it. And then, separate from all of it, the far corral. She saw it before she saw anything else, really, because of what was in it. A black horse moving the way. Water moves when something has disturbed it continuously, restlessly, never quite settling. Even from this distance, she could see the quality of the animal. The size, the build, the particular way he held his head. And she could see even from this distance the way he moved, not the movement of an animal that was energetic or playful, but the movement of an animal that was afraid. She was still looking at the horse when the man appeared at the fence line closest to the road. Nathan Hayes was not quite what she had expected from the conversation at the station, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who work with their bodies rather than manage others working with theirs. His face was weathered, but not old, with dark eyes that assessed her approach with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had learned that most surprises were not good ones. He did not say anything when she reached him. He waited, which she recognized as a form of evaluation. Mr. Hayes, she said. My name is Amelia Carter. I'm looking for work. He looked at her. Not the inventory look of the station master or the women outside the dry goods store. This was something different, more considered taking in information, without yet making a judgment about what to do with it. What kind of work? He said. His voice was low and even. Whatever you need done, that you need done well, she said. But I'd particularly like to work with your horses. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You come from somewhere around here. Kansas. My father runs a horse operation outside Salina. Thomas Carter. He's been training horses for 23 years. Carter. He said the name like he was checking it against something in his memory. I've heard of Thomas Carter's operation. Most people in the horse business have. You trained under him. I worked alongside him, which is different from being trained. He didn't teach me theory. He taught me horses. Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the far corral at the black horse still moving its restless circuit inside the fence. Then he looked back at her. You heard about Shadow, he said. It wasn't a question. I heard enough. Then you know he's put 3 experienced handlers on the ground. One of them's still not walking right. I heard that too. And you're still standing here asking to work with my horses. I'm asking to work with your horses, she said. I'm asking to work with that one in particular. Hayes studied her. A long beat of silence passed between them that contained, she thought, a great deal of the man that she would come to know later. The carefulness, the weight he gave to decisions, the way he didn't let discomfort hurry him. Ma'am, he finally said, with all due respect, I don't know what you think you can do with that animal that 3 experienced. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, she said, and her voice came out level, which she was privately grateful for. Those 3 experienced handlers approached that horse as a problem to be solved by force. I can see from here that that approach hasn't worked. I'm not proposing to use force. What are you proposing to use? Time, she said. And patience. And the understanding that an animal that behaves that way isn't vicious. He's afraid. Those are different things, and they require different responses. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Where are you staying? He said. Nowhere at present. Another beat of silence. There's a small room off the barn, he said finally. It's nothing much. I can offer you room and board and a fair wage if your work earns it. You start with the regular horses. We'll discuss the other matter separately. That's fair, she said. He nodded once. I'll have someone show you the room. He turned to go, then stopped and looked back at her. Miss Carter, what brought you to Red Willow? You didn't come 11 miles from town looking for ranch work because you happened to be passing through. She met his eyes. No, she said. I didn't. She told him the short version. The letters, the arrangement, the note at the station. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to tell anything that needed telling. Look at the person. Say the true thing. Don't dress it up. When she finished, Nathan Hayes looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Ethan Caldwell, he said. You know him. I know of him, Hayes said with a flatness in his voice that told her more than the words did. I'm sorry that happened to you, Miss Carter. Thank you, she said. But I didn't tell you for sympathy. I told you because you asked me a straight question, and you seemed like a man who'd rather have a straight answer. Something in his expression shifted then. It was slight, the faintest easing, like a door that has been braced against opening, giving a quarter-inch of ground. Come on then, he said, and started walking toward the barn. I'll show you around. The hands were already at work when she was brought through. Hayes introduced her briefly. Miss Carter working with us for the season. And the men she met responded with varying degrees of what she had already learned to expect. Some nodded. Some looked at her the way they might look at something that had shown up in an unexpected place, uncertain whether it belonged. A few said nothing at all and returned to their work. And then there was Jack Turner. Jack Turner was the head ranch hand, which meant he was the man the other workers answered to in Hayes's absence, and he wore this authority the way certain men wear hats pulled low, made sure everyone could see it. He was perhaps 40, with large hands and a confidence in his own physical competence that had long since crossed the line into something harder and less flexible. He looked at Amelia with no particular effort to conceal what he thought. Hayes, he said without looking away from her, you taking on laundry staff now. Miss Carter is here to work with the horses, Hayes said, and his voice had a quality to it that Amelia would later understand was a warning. Treat her accordingly. Turner looked at Hayes, then something moving in his expression that wasn't quite challenge and wasn't quite compliance, and then he looked back at Amelia and smiled in the way that contains no warmth. Horses, he said, as if the word were amusing. Right. Amelia looked at him steadily. She had met Jack Turner before. Not this man specifically, but this type of man, the one who mistook confidence in others for a challenge to his own. She had learned early that engaging with this type directly in the first hours cost more than it gained. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Turner," she said pleasantly and precisely. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and moved off toward the fence. The room off the barn was small. It had been used for storage recently and retained the smell of old wood leather, the particular dusty sweetness of hay that had been moved through the space. There was a cot, a small table, a hook on the wall, and a window that looked out directly toward the far corral. She set her trunk against the wall, hung her coat on the hook, and stood at the window. Shadow was still moving. She watched him for a long time. The light shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening, and she stood at that window and watched a horse that was wound so tight with something fear. She was nearly certain fear that had been so long present it had become his entire understanding of the world, and she felt the same thing she had always felt, watching animals that were hurting. Not pity. Not the condescending softness of someone who has never been afraid of anything, and so treats fear like a flaw to be corrected. What she felt was recognition. She knew what it was to have been treated like something was wrong with you. She knew what it was to have the world look at the outside of you and decide it knew the inside without asking. She knew what it was to be written off by people who hadn't taken the time to understand anything about you, and she knew what it was to feel the walls going up inside yourself in response. The way the spirit learns eventually that the safest thing is to stop expecting gentleness from the world. She had not let it make her mean, but she understood how it could. "I see you," she said quietly to the horse that couldn't hear her through the glass and the distance. "And I ain't in any hurry." She was at the fence at first light. Not in the corral, not yet. She understood enough about fear to know that the first thing was simply presence. Not pressure, not demand. Just the fact of being there consistently at a distance the animal could tolerate until that distance ceased to feel threatening. She brought nothing. No rope, no halter, no grain. She sat on the fence rail in the early morning cold with her coat buttoned and her hands in her lap, and she watched the horse the way her father had taught her, without agenda, without trying to make anything happen, simply paying attention. Shadow saw her immediately. He stopped his circuit and faced her from across the corral, his head up, his whole body braced. He was extraordinary up close, taller than she'd realized, black as old iron in the early light, with a quality of compressed energy that even standing still radiated outward like heat. He watched her. She watched him. She was careful not to stare directly at him. Direct eye contact reads as challenge to a frightened horse, and she was not there to challenge him. She watched him the way you watch something you're genuinely curious about. Peripherally, the way you watch weather coming in from the west. He did not approach. He did not run. He simply stood and watched her from across the corral, with the suspicious attention of a creature that had learned to treat stillness as a threat assessment. She stayed for an hour, then climbed down and went about the rest of her work. Turner was in the barn when she came in. "Wasted your morning," he said without looking up from the harness he was mending. "No," she said pleasantly, and went to the task Hayes had assigned her. She was back at the fence that afternoon, and the next morning, and the afternoon after that. On the fourth morning, something changed. She was sitting on the rail in her usual position, watching the mountains beyond the ranch turn pink with the early light, not looking at Shadow directly, and she became aware of a change in the quality of the corral. A stillness, a different kind of stillness than the watchful, frozen stillness of the first days. She looked. Shadow was closer. Not dramatically closer. 20 feet rather than 40. But he had moved voluntarily in her direction, and he was standing with his head slightly lowered, which meant she knew that he was thinking rather than reacting. He was making a decision. That was different from a frightened animal. A frightened animal doesn't make decisions. It only responds. He was thinking about her. She stayed completely still. After a long moment, he took 3 steps, stopped, assessed, took 2 more. He stopped about 12 feet away and looked at her. She looked slightly past him at the mountain. She breathed slowly. She kept her hands loose. For nearly 4 minutes, she counted her own heartbeats afterward, involuntarily, the way you do when something important is happening and your body is recording it, whether you ask it to or not. The black stallion stood 12 feet away from Amelia Carter and decided something. Then he snorted, turned and walked away. But he walked away instead of running. And that she thought climbing down from the fence with her heart still unsteady was everything. Hayes was watching from the barn doorway. She had not known he was there until she turned around, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the morning yard. "He moved toward you," Hayes said. "Yes. He's never done that, not once in 2 years. I was curious," she said. "Curiosity is different from trust, but it's the beginning of it." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the corral where Shadow had resumed his movement, but with a different quality, now less frantic, she thought. Something in the temperature of it had changed. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "what are you doing exactly with him? What is it you're actually doing?" She considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I'm not doing anything," she said finally. "That's the whole point. I'm being something consistent, something that shows up every day and doesn't demand anything from him, and doesn't threaten him, and doesn't leave. I'm giving him a chance to figure out that I'm not what he's been told humans are." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. "My wife used to say something like that," he said quietly. He didn't explain it further. He turned and went back into the barn, and Amelia stood in the morning light and filed that sentence away in the careful part of herself that noticed important things and waited to understand them. Turner watched all of it. He watched it from doorways and fence lines and the far end of the yard, and he watched it with the particular expression of a man whose belief system is being inconvenienced by evidence. He had been working with horses for 20 years, using the methods that worked: control pressure, consistency of consequence. You established dominance. You made clear who was in charge. You didn't sit on fence rails watching an animal decide what it thought about you, because an animal deciding what it thought about you was an animal with the wrong idea about the arrangement. On the 5th afternoon he came to find her where she was working in the barn. "You know what you're doing out there is a waste of time," he said. "You're welcome to that opinion," she said. "That horse is dangerous. Hayes ought to put him down instead of letting you play games with him." "Shadow isn't dangerous," she said, keeping her hands on the work. "He's been hurt. There's a difference. A horse that puts people on the ground is dangerous regardless of the reason. A dog that bites because it's been kicked is dangerous in the same way," she said. "Does that mean the dog should be killed, or does it mean we should stop kicking it?" Turner looked at her. "You think you're going to ride that horse?" he said. "Eventually," she said. "I've seen men with 20 years on me try to ride that horse and end up in the dirt." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to try to ride him. I'm going to wait until he's ready to let me." Turner shook his head with the slow deliberateness of a man recording his prediction for later. "You're going to get yourself killed," he said. "And Hayes is going to have a dead woman on his conscience and a horse that's proven it can't be managed." "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Turner," she said pleasantly and precisely, just as she had the first time. "I'll be careful." He left. She exhaled slowly and went back to her work. But that night, lying on the cot with the window open and the Montana night coming in, cool off the mountains, she heard the horse moving in the far corral, and she thought about what Turner had said, not because it frightened her, but because she had learned long ago that fear, like horses, needed to be understood rather than denied. She was afraid, not of Shadow, of failing, of being wrong about this animal, about this place, about her own ability to do the one thing she'd told Nathan Hayes she could do. She was 27 years old, and she had just walked 11 miles with her trunk and her father's training, and absolutely nothing else, and told a man that she could do something nobody else had managed, and if she was wrong about that, she had nothing. She thought about Ethan Caldwell's note. 11 words. 7 years. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup, saying, "You've known his letters 7 years, Amelia. That ain't always the same thing." She thought about Shadow standing 12 feet away from her and choosing not to run. "You and me both," she said quietly to the dark and the horse sounds outside her window. "We're both trying to figure out who we can trust." She was at the fence before sunrise the next morning. Shadow was waiting. She didn't know how to explain it, except that it felt like waiting the way he was facing the fence, the quality of his stillness. He hadn't been pacing. He had been standing facing the direction she came from, and when she climbed up on the fence rail, he walked toward her with a purposefulness that made her breath stop for just a moment. He stopped 4 feet away. She could hear him breathe. She could see the particular darkness of his eyes, the depth of them, the intelligence that moved in them that had been so many times mistaken for madness. She said very quietly, "Good morning." He put his nose out, slowly, extending his neck the way a horse does when it's choosing to reach toward something rather than having the something brought to it. His nose came within 2 feet of her hand, which was resting on the rail, and she did not move her hand, and she did not move, and she breathed as slowly as she could manage, and she let him decide. He breathed against her knuckles, just once, warm and soft. And then he raised his head and looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that look she would try later to explain this to Nathan Hayes, and find that language was genuinely insufficient for it. In that there was something that was neither dominance nor submission, but was something closer to what exists between two beings who have decided provisionally to trust each other with the fragile fact of their own fear. "There you are," she said softly. "I wondered when you'd be ready." Hayes had come out of the house in the early morning and was standing at the edge of the yard, stock still watching. She climbed down from the fence carefully and walked toward him, and he looked like a man who wasn't entirely sure what he had just witnessed. "How long?" he said. "How long before you think he'll—" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Weeks maybe, maybe longer. There's no schedule for this, Mr. Hayes." He nodded slowly. "Whitmore is coming at the end of the month," he said. "He wants an answer about the debt." "What kind of answer?" "The kind that determines whether I still have a ranch." He paused. "Shadow is that animal is the ranch's future if I can prove he's trainable. Without that—" He stopped. She looked at him. "I won't rush him," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. Rushing a frightened animal doesn't make it braver. It makes it break in ways that can't be fixed." "I know," he said quietly. "I know that." There was something in his voice that she thought was about more than the horse. "But I will do everything I can," she said. "Everything I know how to do. You have my word on that." Nathan Hayes looked at her in the early Montana morning, with the mountains at his back, and something in his expression that she would think about later, that careful, weighted look of a man who has learned to be cautious with hope because hope has cost him before. "All right," he said. And then quietly, like a man reminding himself of something, "All right." The morning shadow breathed against her knuckles. Everything on the Hayes ranch shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that real change always moves quietly beneath the surface, the way water finds new paths through stone. Amelia didn't tell anyone what had happened at the fence that morning. She climbed down, walked back to the barn, picked up her work, and said nothing. She had learned early in life that announcing progress invites opinions about progress, and she didn't need anyone's opinion about what had just passed between her and that horse. She only needed to be back at the fence the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. Jack Turner noticed, of course. Turner noticed everything that happened on this ranch, which was his right and his job, and also she was beginning to understand something that had become tangled up in his identity, in a way that made it difficult for him to separate the job from the person. He came to the barn that evening while she was finishing up and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a man who has spent the day revising his irritation. "Hayes told me what he saw this morning," Turner said. "Did he?" she said. "The horse came toward you." "Yes." "That doesn't mean anything. An animal gets curious. Doesn't mean it trusts you. Doesn't mean it won't put you on the ground first chance it gets." She straightened up and looked at him. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't mean all of that yet." That yet seemed to land somewhere in Turner's chest that he didn't appreciate because his jaw tightened in a way she was coming to recognize. "I've been working horses longer than you've been working anywhere," he said. "And I'm telling you, you're reading something into that animal that isn't there. You want it to be a certain kind of story. A woman nobody believed in, a horse, nobody could touch, a miracle that proves everybody wrong. Wrong. That's a nice story. It ain't necessarily what's happening in that corral. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. You might be right, she said finally. He blinked. That wasn't the response he'd been preparing for. But I've been wrong before and kept working, she continued. And I've been right before without knowing it yet. And in both cases, the only thing that mattered was showing up the next morning. So that's what I'm going to do. She went back to her work, and after a moment, she heard him leave, and she exhaled slowly through her nose and thought about what he'd said. Not dismissively, because Turner wasn't stupid. And dismissing what wasn't stupid was its own kind of arrogance. He was right that she wanted a certain kind of story. She did. She had wanted a certain kind of story her whole life, and wanting it had sometimes made her see it too early. But she also knew what she had seen in Shadow's eyes that morning. And she knew the difference between an animal that was curious and an animal that had made a decision, however provisional, however small. Shadow had made a decision. She was back at the fence before light. He was there, facing the fence again. Waiting in the way that wasn't quite waiting, but was a quality of orientation the animal equivalent of a door left ajar. She climbed the rail and settled in her usual position, and for a long while, neither of them did anything except exist in the same space, which was, she had come to understand, exactly the right thing. After about 20 minutes, he walked to her, not to the spot 4 feet away where he'd stopped the morning before. Closer. Close enough that she could see the detail of him in the early light, the particular shape of the scar along his neck that she'd noticed from a distance, and now up close could see clearly, old, well-healed, long. The kind of scar that comes from wire, or a blade, not from a fall. Someone had hurt this horse deliberately. She felt the anger of it move through her like cold water, and she let it move through and kept her breathing steady, and didn't let it change anything about her posture or her stillness, because Shadow would feel it if it changed her. I was exquisitely sensitive to human tension, and she had learned that about him the way she learned everything about horses, by watching and by trusting what she observed. I know, she said very quietly. I know somebody did that to you, and I'm sorry. He put his nose against her knee. Just rested it there, light as anything. The warm weight of it barely registering through the fabric of her skirt. And she sat absolutely still, and felt the particular quality of the moment, the way some moments announce themselves as significant before you fully understand why, before you can name what has changed. He trusted her knee. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing that had happened at the Hayes Ranch in a very long time. She put her hand very slowly on his nose. He didn't pull away. She heard footsteps behind her, more than one person, she thought, and she didn't turn around because turning around would break this, and nothing that was behind her was worth breaking this. She kept her hand where it was, and she breathed, and Shadow breathed, and the Montana morning went on around them. When he finally raised his head and stepped back, she turned. Hayes was there. 3 of the ranch hands were with him, men who had been arriving for morning work and had stopped when they'd seen what was happening at the far corral. They were standing in a loose group near the barn, far enough away not to disturb anything, close enough that they'd seen all of it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then, one of the younger hands, she didn't know his name yet. He'd only arrived 2 days before, a boy of maybe 20, with a face that hadn't quite finished deciding what it was going to look like, said very quietly, Lord Almighty. Hayes said nothing. But the expression on his face was the kind that men like Nathan Hayes worked hard not to have, the kind that showed up when something got past the guard they kept, and it was not the expression of a man watching a training exercise. It was the expression of a man watching something he'd stopped believing was possible. Turner wasn't in the group. Amelia noticed his absence, the way you notice the absence of something that has been consistently present, and she filed it away. She climbed down from the fence and walked toward Hayes, and he met her halfway across the yard. That scar on his neck, she said before he could speak. The long one. Do you know where it came from? His expression changed. Something darkened. Previous owner, he said. Before I bought him. I didn't know about it until I had him here and got close enough to see. What happened to the previous owner? Nothing that should have, Hayes said with a flatness that told her what he thought about that. I want to ask you something honestly. All right. How long have you been doing this, working with horses this way, your father's method? Since I was 9, she said. But I've been thinking about horses my whole life. You don't really separate those two things. Have you ever failed taken on an animal and not been able to reach it? She looked at him steadily. Once, she said. A gelding in Selena. He'd been broken down too far, too long without anyone treating him like something worth trusting. By the time we got to him, there wasn't enough left to reach. She paused. But Shadow isn't that horse. Shadow is angry and frightened, but he's still curious. Curiosity means there's still something looking outward. That's what we need. That's what we're working with. Hayes absorbed this. And you believe he can be ridden. I believe he can choose to be ridden, she said carefully. Which is different. A horse that's been forced carries that force in its body. You can feel it when you're on it. The readiness to resist the resentment sitting just under the compliance. A horse that chooses is a different animal entirely. He looked at her for a long moment. My wife used to say, he began and then stopped. You don't have to explain that, she said. No, he said. I know. He looked away toward the mountains, then back. She died 4 years ago, Margaret. She had a way of she understood things at an angle that I didn't. Came at problems differently than me. He paused. You remind me of that, the way you come at this differently. It was perhaps the most personal thing he had said to her, and she understood that it had not been easy for him to say, and had not been planned. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Thank you, he said simply, and turned toward the barn. Turner's been asking around about you, he said without looking back. About your family, your father's operation. She felt something tighten slightly in her chest. And what has he found? Nothing but what you told me, which I expected. He did glance back then. Turner's not a bad man, Miss Carter. He's a man who's invested a great deal of himself in knowing how things work, and you're suggesting that things work differently than he knows. That's uncomfortable for a person who's built their confidence on certainty. I understand that, she said. And she did. More than he knew. The 2 weeks that followed had the quality of something gaining momentum slowly, not dramatically in the way that real things build. She went to the fence morning and evening. Shadow came to her more quickly each time. She introduced her hand to his neck, then his shoulder, then his flank. Each new contact required its own time, its own negotiation, its own patience on both sides. She did not rush. She did not celebrate out loud. She worked. The ranch hand's skepticism shifted in degrees the way weather shifts, not all at once, but unmistakably. The young one whose name she learned was Danny Reeves started appearing near the far corral, on mornings he had no reason to be there. An older hand named Cal Briggs, who had barely spoken to her in her first week, began leaving coffee outside her room in the mornings, the cup set on the trunk she used as a step. He never said anything about it, and she never thanked him directly, which they both seemed to understand was the correct arrangement. Turner continued to resist. She had stopped expecting otherwise, and had arrived somewhat against her will at a position of genuine respect for the consistency of his resistance. He believed what he believed, and he had the spine to keep believing it, even as the evidence arranged itself around him in ways that were inconvenient to his position. There was a kind of integrity in that, even when it was directed at you. One afternoon, near the end of the 2nd week, she was working a young quarter horse in the paddock ordinary work, a young animal, learning the basic language of pressure and release, and Turner came to the fence rail and watched for a long time without speaking. She finished what she was doing and brought the young horse to a stop near where Turner stood. You're good with the regular ones, he said. It came out reluctant, but not dishonest. Thank you. Your father teach you that specific exercise. He showed me the principle. I worked out the details for this horse based on what I observed him doing. Turner was quiet for a moment. I learned to train horses from a man named Garrett outside Cheyenne. 30 years working cattle ranches. Best horseman I ever saw. He paused. He would have said what you're doing with Shadow is dangerous. He might have been right, she said. I might be wrong. You keep saying that, Turner said. You keep allowing for the possibility that you're wrong. I can't decide if that's honest or if it's a strategy. She looked at him. It's honest, she said. I've been wrong before about things I cared about. It's a painful experience. I'd rather anticipate the possibility than be surprised by it. Something moved in Turner's face. For just a moment, brief as a shadow crossing ground, something that was not hostility lived there. The woman in Kansas, he said. The arrangement. She hadn't told Turner about Ethan Caldwell, which meant Hayes had. Yes, she said. And you still came out here, after that. After that, she confirmed. He nodded once slowly, with the nod of a man who is reclassifying something in his internal ledger, without necessarily announcing the reclassification. Well, he said, and pushed off the fence and walked away. Which was, she was learning as close as Jack Turner got to a compliment. The day Richard Whitmore arrived changed the atmosphere of the ranch the way pressure changes before a storm perceptibly in the body before the sky gives any indication. She knew who he was before she was told, because she had learned in her life that a certain kind of man carries his intention on him, the way other men carry their tools visibly as a statement of what he's come to do. Whitmore rode in with 2 associates men who wore town clothes on horses and looked at the ranch with the particular assessment of people who are calculating value rather than seeing it. Whitmore himself was perhaps 50 thick through the middle, with a broad, handsome face that had learned long ago to arrange itself into expressions of warmth, while the eyes behind it performed different work entirely. He shook Nathan's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who has already decided the outcome of the meeting he's walking into. Amelia was near the barn and watched the greeting from a distance. She watched Hayes's posture, the careful straightness of it, the precise control of a man who cannot afford to show how much is at stake. She watched Whitmore's eyes move around the ranch property with that assessing quality, and she watched the moment when his eyes found the far corral and shadow, and the small, satisfied smile that crossed his face, which he hadn't bothered to suppress because he thought nobody was watching him closely enough. She watched that smile and felt something cold and certain settle into the base of her spine. This man had already decided that Shadow was proof of the ranch's failure. Turner came to stand beside her, which surprised her. Whitmore offered to buy out the note twice in the past year, he said quietly, not looking at her. Each time Hayes turned him down, but the terms got worse each time. How much time does Mr. Hayes have? End of the month to show the operation is viable. Whitmore's definition of viable. Turner's voice was neutral in the way that voices are when they are working to contain something that isn't neutral. Shadow was supposed to be proof. A trained stallion of that bloodline is worth more than the rest of the operation combined. But Shadow isn't... He stopped. I know what Shadow isn't yet, she said. Whitmore is going to walk through this ranch and see an unmanageable horse and a struggling operation and a man who's been too proud to cut his losses, Turner said. And Hayes is going to stand there and let him, because Hayes doesn't know how to be anything other than what he is. Is that an admirable quality or a foolish one? She said. Turner was quiet for a moment. Both, he said. Depending on the day. Whitmore toured the ranch for 2 hours. Amelia watched the tour from wherever her work took her, which was not entirely by accident, generally within observational distance. She watched Whitmore at the paddocks where he was pleasant and complimentary in the way that people are when they are about to be unpleasant and want the contrast to do their work for them. She watched him at the main barn where he asked questions about operating costs with the polite interest of a man who already knows the answers. And she watched him at the far corral where he stood with Hayes at the fence rail and looked at Shadow for a long time. Magnificent animal, Whitmore said, with the tone of a man describing something that used to be valuable. Shame about the temperament. The temperament is being addressed, Hayes said. Is it? Whitmore looked at Shadow, who had come to the center of the corral and was watching the 2 men with his head up, alert, but not panicked, a development that Amelia noted with a private satisfaction. 2 weeks ago, he would have been at the far end of the fence. By who? By a trainer I've brought on, Hayes said. What trainer? Her name is Amelia Carter. Her father runs Thomas Carter's operation out of Salina. Whitmore looked at Hayes. Thomas Carter, he said. The Kansas man. Yes. And Thomas Carter's what his daughter is here working with this animal. She is. Whitmore looked back at the horse. Shadow had not moved. He was still watching, his head still up, and in the quality of his watchfulness. There was something that looked to Amelia, watching from 30 yards away, less like fear and more like assessment. He was looking at these men the way she looked at new situations, taking information, not yet deciding. "Hayes," Whitmore said pleasantly. "I like you, you know that. I've always respected that you built this operation yourself. But a man who's sitting on debt, he can't service, and pinning his hopes on an animal nobody can touch, and a woman." He paused in the way that pauses are sometimes used as punctuation. "I'm trying to save you from a worse outcome than the one you're walking toward." "I appreciate that," Hayes said in a tone that did not appreciate it. "End of the month," Whitmore said. "Same offer. I won't make it a third time." He came back toward the barn then, and his path took him within speaking distance of Amelia, who did not step back and did not look away. He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether something is worth his time. "Miss Carter," he said. Hayes must have pointed her out. "I understand you're working with the Stallion." "I am," she said. "How's that going?" "It's going," she said. He smiled. "I knew your father's operation. Thomas Carter's a talented man." He paused. "Is talent hereditary, do you think?" It was the particular kind of question designed to require a response that either overclaims or underclaims, and she recognized the mechanism of it with the calm of someone who has been on the receiving end of that particular design before. "I think talent's irrelevant," she said pleasantly. "What matters is whether the work gets done." He looked at her for a moment, the pleasant expression not shifting, but the eyes behind it doing a rapid recalculation. "Good answer," he said, and moved on. That evening, Hayes knocked on the door of her room. She opened it, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. A gesture she had come to understand was the external expression of some internal negotiation he was having with himself. "I need to be honest with you about the timeline," he said. "All right. I need something demonstrable before the end of the month. Not a finished animal, not a fully trained horse, but something I can point to and say this is a viable outcome. This animal has a future. Because without that, Whitmore buys the debt, and I sell, or I lose everything I've built here, to a bank that doesn't care about the difference." He paused. "I'm not asking you to rush. I'm asking you to tell me honestly whether what you need more time for is something I have the time to give." She looked at him in the lamplight, this careful, proud man who had offered her a room off his barn when she had nowhere else to go, and had never once made her feel that the offering was charity. And she thought about Shadow at the fence that morning, the way the Stallion had stood still while she ran her hand along his shoulder, the way he'd breathed slowly, the way his eye had stayed soft. "I need 3 more weeks," she said. "At the pace we're moving. The end of the month is 2.5 weeks." "I know." He absorbed this. "Can you—" "I won't rush him, Mr. Hayes, but I can be more deliberate. There's a difference between rushing and being intentional about the progression. I've been giving him time to find his own pace. I can guide that pace more actively without forcing it." Hayes looked at her. "Is there a risk in that?" "There's always a risk," she said honestly. "If I push too hard and he decides he can't trust me, we lose everything we've built. If I guide the progression carefully and he responds, and I believe he will respond, we might be able to give Whitmore something to look at." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "What would you need?" "Nothing different than what I have. Just your patience and your trust that I know what I'm doing." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she read everything that Nathan Hayes didn't say easily. The worry, the weight of 4 years of working this land alone. Since Margaret died, the specific fear of a proud man confronting the possibility that pride might not be enough. "You have it," he said. "Both." He turned to go, and she said, "Mr. Hayes." He stopped. "Thank you for not lying to me about the timeline," she said. "I'd rather know the real situation than a comfortable version of it." He turned back, and for just a moment, the careful guard of his expression gave way to something warmer and more unguarded. "I had a feeling that was true about you," he said, "from about the first 5 minutes of the first day." He left. She stood in the doorway of her small room and listened to the Montana night and thought about 2.5 weeks, and everything that had to happen inside them. And she thought about Shadow, and she thought about what her father had told her the year she turned 15, and had been impatient with a frightened mare who was taking longer than she thought she should. Fear doesn't have a schedule, Amelia. You can't negotiate with it. You can only outlast it. She went back inside and sat on the edge of the cot and put her hands on her knees and breathed, and she decided that outlasting it was exactly what she intended to do. The next morning she changed her approach, not the foundation of it. She did not introduce pressure, did not change the quality of her presence, did not bring anything to the fence that hadn't been there before. But she was more deliberate. She moved through the stages of contact, hand to nose, hand to neck, hand to shoulder, with more intention, spending the time necessary at each stage, but not lingering beyond what was needed. She thought of it having a clearer conversation. Still patient, but clearer. Shadow responded. He responded as though he had been waiting for clarity, as though the long patient period of her simply being present had built a foundation that was ready now for the next thing. He accepted her hand on his shoulder without trembling. He accepted the lead rope, not attached to anything, just present in her hand, without retreating. When she draped it across his neck on the third morning, and left it there, and walked away, he stood still and let it rest there, and she watched from 30 feet away as he made his peace with the weight of the thing that had previously been a source of fear. Danny Reeves appeared at the fence beside her as she watched Shadow with the rope on his neck. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, with the hushed quality of someone watching something they don't want to interrupt. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you know what to do next? Like, how do you know what step to take?" She thought about it honestly. "I watch him," she said. "What he can absorb without shutting down. What makes him curious versus what makes him retreat. The next step is always just slightly beyond where he's comfortable, but only slightly. You want to expand the comfort, not blow past it." "Turner says you can't trust what a horse decides," the boy said. "He says the horse has to learn that the human decides." "Turner's method works," she said carefully. "I'm not saying it doesn't. It produces obedient horses. But obedience and trust aren't the same thing, and for a horse like Shadow who's had his trust destroyed by people, obedience might not be enough. Obedience can live alongside resentment. Trust can't coexist with it." Danny thought about this with the concentrated seriousness of someone young enough to still believe that understanding things matters. "What if it doesn't work?" he said. "What if he just can't?" "Then I'll know I tried the right way," she said. "And that matters to me. Not as much as succeeding, but it matters." He nodded slowly, with the nod of a young person absorbing something that they sense will be important later in ways they can't yet specify. 3 days later, Turner came to the fence. He came at mid-morning when she was standing inside the corral. Inside for the first time, no fence between her and Shadow, and the stallion was standing 8 feet away from her, with his head slightly lowered and his eye soft, and she was talking to him in the low, even voice she'd been using since the beginning. Nothing specific in the words, just the pattern and the tone, the consistent proof that her voice meant nothing to be afraid of. Turner stood at the fence and watched. She did not acknowledge him. She stayed present with Shadow. Shadow kept the quality of her attention where it needed to be, and she felt more than heard the way Turner settled against the fence post and went still in the way that a person goes still when they have decided to actually look at something rather than observe it through the filter of what they already believe. Shadow flicked an ear toward the fence. "Easy," she said softly. "That's just Turner. He ain't a threat. Loud sometimes, but not a threat." Turner at the fence made a sound. She thought it might have been a laugh. Shadow's ear swiveled back to her, and she held her ground and held his attention. And after a moment, he took 2 steps toward her, with the deliberateness she had come to know the choosing quality of it, the decision being made in real time, and stopped 4 feet away and looked at her. "There it is," she said quietly. "Good." She stood with him for another 10 minutes, then walked slowly to the fence. Turner moved back to give her room to climb over. She came over the rail and stood beside him, and they looked at Shadow together, and Shadow looked back at them, without retreating, without circling, just standing in the Montana morning with the quality of an animal that has renegotiated its relationship with the world. You went in the corral, Turner said. Yes. When did you decide to do that? This morning, she said. He told me he was ready. Turner was quiet. I owe you an apology, he said then, and the words came out with the careful deliberateness of words that have been considered before being spoken. First days you were here, I was... He paused. I was not respectful. She looked at him. I appreciate that, she said. I'm still not convinced you're right, he said, because Turner was Turner. But I was not respectful, and that's separate from whether you're right. Yes, she said. It is. He nodded. He looked at Shadow for another moment. What's the next step, he said, and the question was not hostile or challenging. It was the question of a man who has decided, however provisionally, to be interested. The saddle, she said. And then the weight. And then, if he's willing. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Turner looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the Hayes Ranch, what she saw in his face was something that was neither resistance nor hostility, but was something older and more fundamental than either of those things. It was respect. You'd best not get thrown, he said gruffly. Hayes would never forgive himself. She looked back at the horse. I don't intend to get thrown, she said. And neither does he. Shadow lifted his head in the morning air and stood still against the Montana sky, and the Hayes Ranch breathed around them, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called once and went quiet, and Amelia Carter felt for the first time since she'd stood on that station platform with a note in 2 pieces and nowhere left to go that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Turner's words were still hanging in the morning air when Nathan Hayes appeared at the barn door, coffee cup in hand, watching the two of them at the fence, with the expression of a man trying not to read too much into what he was seeing. He'd been watching more than he let on. Amelia had noticed that about him, the way he observed from doorways, from distances, the way his eyes moved over things he cared about, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that caring openly was its own kind of risk. He came across the yard slowly and stopped at the fence beside Turner, and for a moment the 3 of them stood looking at Shadow, who was still in the center of the corral. Still unhurried, still holding that quality of presence that was so different from what he'd been when she arrived, that it occasionally stopped her in her own thoughts. Saddle, Hayes said quietly. He wasn't asking. When he's ready, she said. How close? She looked at the horse. Shadow's head was low, his breathing slow. He was watching her from across the corral, with the focused, quiet attention that she had come to understand was his version of contentment, or as close to contentment as an animal carrying this much history could reach. Day after tomorrow, she said. Maybe sooner. Hayes was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Whitmore sent a man out yesterday afternoon, while you were working. Wanted to know if there'd been any change. She turned to look at him. What did you tell him? I told him there'd been progress. And? He said progress wasn't the same thing as results. Hayes paused. He's right about that. I know he is, she said. He's going to get his results. Hayes looked at her with that careful, weighted look she'd come to know, the look of a man who wanted to believe something and was holding the wanting at a distance from the believing until the evidence closed the gap. All right, he said. He handed her the coffee cup still half full and turned back toward the house. She looked at the cup in her hand. Then she looked at Turner. Turner was staring at the horse. He gave you his coffee, he said with a flatness that contained, she thought, more than one kind of observation. He did, she said. Nathan Hayes has given his cup of coffee to exactly 2 people in the 4 years I've worked this ranch, Turner said. His daughter when she visited, and the vet when he saved one of the mares last winter. She looked at the cup. I'll take it as a good sign, she said. Turner made a sound that was halfway between skepticism and something warmer. You might at that, he said. The next 36 hours moved with the specific pressured clarity of time that knows it is running out. Amelia worked with Shadow morning and afternoon each session, building on the last with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that the difference between too fast and just fast enough can be the difference between everything and nothing. She introduced the saddle blanket first, not on his back, just present, draped over the fence, and he eyed it. He circled it once in his thoughts without moving his feet, and then he put his nose on it and breathed, and she stood 3 feet away and said, "There you go, just a blanket. Ain't nothing in this world to be afraid of in a blanket." Danny Reeves watched this from the fence with the focused attention he'd been bringing to everything she did for the past week. He'd started taking notes. She'd noticed a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket and took out during breaks, writing things down with the quick seriousness of someone building a foundation for knowledge they intend to keep. "Miss Carter," he said during a break in the afternoon, "can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal," she said, but not unkindly. "When you came here," he said carefully, "from what I heard, and I don't mean to overstep it, sounds like it wasn't by choice exactly, that you came to Red Willow because you had to." "That's accurate," she said. "Does it bother you being here because of someone else's bad decision?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "There was a time," she said, "when I would have said yes to that without hesitating. But I've been thinking about it differently lately." She looked at Shadow, who was now standing with the saddle blanket resting lightly across his back, unbothered. "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the thing that takes you exactly where you needed to be. You can spend a lot of energy being angry at the road that brought you to the right place, or you can just be grateful you arrived." Danny wrote something in his notebook. She looked at him. "What are you writing down?" He looked up, slightly embarrassed. "That," he said. "What you just said." She laughed, the first real laugh she'd had since she arrived in Montana, the kind that comes from genuine surprise. And Danny grinned, and Shadow lifted his head and looked at them both, and she thought, this is what this feels like. This is what it feels like when things are going right. The saddle blanket was on his back by the end of that afternoon. She left it there for 20 minutes while she stood at the fence, and he moved around the corral with it in place, with only a couple of moments of adjustment, shaking himself once, sidestepping once, and then settling into it with the resigned practicality of an intelligent animal that has decided the thing on its back is not a threat. "Blankets on," Turner said, materializing at the fence with the predictability of a man who had given up pretending he wasn't watching. "Blankets on," she confirmed. "Saddle tomorrow. Saddle tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there," he said. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like something else entirely. Something she didn't want to name, in case naming it broke the fragile, unexpected thing that had been slowly building between her and Jack Turner over these weeks. "I know," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." He almost smiled. She woke before dawn the next morning, with the specific, sharpened awareness of someone who has been sleeping lightly because something significant is waiting on the other side of the night. She lay on the cot in the dark and went through it methodically. The saddle, the weight, the patience, the signals to watch for that would tell her to stop, and the signals that would tell her to continue. She went through it the way her father had taught her to go through anything that mattered, slowly, thoroughly, with the honest acknowledgement of every place where something could go wrong. Then she got up and went to the corral. Shadow was awake. He watched her approach the fence with the alert, focused attention that she now recognized as his version of greeting. The way he tracked her specifically, rather than watching the yard in general. The particular quality of his attention when it was directed at her versus at anything else. "Morning," she said, climbing the fence. "Big day." She spent an hour just being with him before she introduced the saddle. Let him find his rhythm. Let this morning settle around them. Let the space between them reach the particular quality of ease that had taken 3 weeks to build, and was, she was aware, fragile in ways she couldn't entirely predict. The saddle came from the fence in a deliberate, unhurried motion. Shadow saw it and stopped. She stopped too. "You know what this is," she said quietly. "You've seen it before, and somebody used it on you in a way that wasn't right. I know that. I'm not going to do that." She kept her voice low and even, the words mattering less than the tone. "This is just the next thing, Shadow. That's all it is. Just the next thing between you and me." He blew out a breath. She moved toward him, saddle across her forearm, and he held his ground. His ears moved forward, then sideways, reading her, processing the exquisitely sensitive machinery of him working through what this meant. She stopped 3 feet from him and let him look at the saddle. Let him process it in his own time. He put his nose on it. She waited. He breathed against the leather, took in the smell of it, and she watched his eyes and watched his body for the signals. The muscle tension along the neck that would mean refusal, the shift of weight backward that would mean retreat. Neither came. Instead, after a long moment, he raised his head and looked at her. "All right," she said. "All right then." She moved the saddle to his back. The moment she laid it across him, his whole body went rigid, every muscle in him simultaneously bracing the tremendous coiled energy of him, pulling taut like a cable under load. And she stood with her hand flat against his side and said, "Easy, easy, easy, easy," in the steady rhythm of it, not releasing the saddle, not pulling back, just being present and constant through his fear while he decided what to do with it. He trembled. She felt it through her whole hand, the fine, rapid trembling of an animal in the grip of something overwhelming the body's memory of pain, activating in spite of everything the mind might be learning. She kept her hand flat against him and kept talking low and steady, and she did not move, and she did not back away, and after what felt like much longer than the 3 minutes it probably was, the trembling slowed and stopped. Shadow stood under the saddle. I didn't like it. She could feel that he didn't like it in the held quality of his stillness, the careful way he was managing himself. But he was managing himself. He was choosing to stay. She heard someone exhale hard behind her and realized that there were more people at the fence than she'd known about. She didn't turn around. She kept her hand on Shadow's side and stayed present with him, and she heard Turner's voice rough and low, "Lord in heaven." And Danny's voice, "She did it." And then Nathan Hayes, quieter than both of them, barely audible, "She did it." She spent another hour with the saddle on him, walked him in slow circles with it. Let him find that the saddle moved with him, didn't grip or catch, wasn't a trap. Watched his body slowly let go of the held quality. Watched the tension ease out of him by degrees until he was moving with something approaching his natural stride. When she brought him to a stop and lifted the saddle off, he turned his head and looked at her with the specific look that she had no adequate language for, but that she understood as completely as she understood anything. She put her hand on his nose. "Good," she said. "You did so good." She came over the fence and the group at the rail. Turner Hayes, Danny Cal Briggs, two other hands whose names she was still learning were looking at her with expressions that covered a range from stunned to moved to something she could only describe as reverent. Hayes stepped forward. He started to say something, and then didn't, and then said, "Miss Carter, and stopped again. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We still need him to accept weight." "When?" Hayes said. "Give him today with the saddle. Tomorrow I put weight across the saddle, not riding, just pressure from above. Day after that." She paused. "Day after that, we see." Hayes looked at her. The math was obvious to both of them. Day after tomorrow was 2 days before Whitmore's deadline. "All right," he said. And then, with a directness that she hadn't heard from him before, "What do you need?" "Same as always," she said. "Just time and space to do this right." He nodded. And then he did something she did not expect. He put out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His grip was firm and warm and brief. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you to know I'm grateful you walked up that road." She thought about the train station, the note, the 11 miles. "So am I," she said, and meant it completely. The next day brought wind off the mountains, the kind that doesn't make up its mind about direction, and Shadow felt it. She could tell when she arrived at the fence there was a quality to his movement that was slightly elevated, slightly more electric. The wind activating some primal awareness in him that all the trust they'd built couldn't entirely override. This was the horse he was underneath everything, not wild, not vicious, but deeply, essentially alive to the world, in ways that most domestic horses had long since had educated out of them. She adjusted. She spent the first 40 minutes simply being with him, matching her energy to the reduced calm she needed him to find, and she talked to him more than usual, keeping her voice consistent against the variability of the wind. Turner appeared at the fence around mid-morning. He watched her work for a while, and then said quietly, "Whitmore sent another man out. stayed at the end of the road, didn't come in. Just watched. She processed this without showing it. How long was he there? 20 minutes or so. Left when he saw you'd gone into the corral. She kept her attention on Shadow. Whitmore wants to watch him fail, she said. Or wants to document that nothing's changed, Turner said. Same effect. Not quite the same effect, she said. Watching him fail means he had to try. Documenting nothing's changed means the whole question stays open. She paused. He doesn't know what's happened this week. He saw an unmanageable horse 2 weeks ago. He doesn't know what he's coming back to. Turner was quiet for a moment. That's actually somewhat reassuring, he said in the tone of a man who doesn't find things reassuring easily. Hold on to it, she said. We're going to need it. That afternoon, with the wind slightly calmer, she introduced the weight. Not her full weight, not yet. She folded 2 heavy horse blankets and laid them across the saddle and pressed down, leaning her weight into her hands, giving Shadow the feeling of pressure from above. He moved under it once, a sideways step, and she moved with him, keeping the pressure consistent, and said, "Easy, easy." And he stopped, and she kept the pressure for 30 seconds and then released it. He stood. She did it again, and again. By the 4th time, he didn't move under the pressure at all. He stood and breathed and accepted it, and she thought about every man who had tried to conquer this horse with force, and wondered what they had felt in those moments before Shadow had sent them over the rail, whether they had understood even in that instant that they were asking the wrong question. You couldn't ask a horse like Shadow to submit. You had to ask him to choose, and choosing took everything she had given him, the weeks of patience, the hours at the fence, the cold mornings and the wind and the coffee she hadn't finished, and the moments when she lay on her cot at night, wondering if she was wrong about all of it. Every single one of those hours had gone into building what was happening right now, this animal standing under pressure and choosing to stay. She came off the fence that evening to find Hayes waiting for her, and next to him, unexpectedly, was a woman she hadn't seen before, perhaps 60, with the weathered, steady-eyed look of someone who has lived outdoors most of her life, wearing a good wool coat and holding her hat in her hands. "Miss Carter," Hayes said. "This is Ruth Alcott. She owns the Alcott spread about 12 miles east. She heard—" He stopped and something moved across his face. "Word has gotten around about what you're doing with Shadow." Ruth Alcott looked at Amelia with the direct, unglamorous appraisal of a woman who has built everything she has herself. "I've got 2 horses that nobody can touch," she said. "Different situation from yours here, but—" She paused. "I'd like to talk to you about whether you'd be willing to consult. After this is settled." Amelia looked at Hayes, and he looked back at her with the expression of a man who has just watched something he'd been hoping for begin to become real. "After this is settled," Amelia said, turning back to Ruth Alcott. "I'd be glad to." Ruth Alcott nodded once with finality. "I'll be in touch," she said, and left the way she'd arrived, directly without ceremony, as though she had established what she came to establish, and had no reason to linger. Amelia watched her go. "She's not a woman who wastes her time," Hayes said quietly. "No," Amelia said. "I could see that. Amelia." He said her first name, and it was the first time he had, and he seemed to notice this and not step back from it. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she said. "If it goes—" He stopped. "If it goes well," she said. "We'll have something to show Whitmore. If it doesn't, we'll figure out what's next." She paused. "One thing at a time, Mr. Hayes." "Nathan," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Nathan," he said again, not elaborating. "One thing at a time, Nathan," she said. He nodded. The warmth in his expression was careful and real, and both of them let it stand without examining it further, because there are some things that you understand best when you leave them unspoken long enough for them to become certain. She was at the fence before dawn. The whole ranch was awake before dawn. She became aware of this gradually. As the light came, the presence of figures at the barn, at the far fence at the edges of the yard. Turner was at the corral rail. Danny was beside him. Cal Briggs and 3 other hands stood at the near fence. Hayes was at the barn doorway. Ruth Alcott, who should not have been there, was there. Amelia saw all of this and made a deliberate choice not to let it change anything about what she brought into that corral. She breathed. She set her attention on the only thing that mattered right now, which was the black horse on the other side of the fence. Shadow saw her and came toward the fence, not quickly. With the measured, deliberate movement that she had come to love in him, the way he chose every step, every gesture, as though nothing about how he engaged with the world would ever again be accidental. He had been accidental once, driven by fear. He wasn't that anymore. She climbed the fence and dropped into the corral. The entire ranch seemed to stop breathing. She walked to him slowly, talking low, and he stood and let her come, and she checked the saddle already on him from this morning's prep, and checked the cinch, and checked his eye, which was soft and present, and focused on her. "Okay," she said very quietly. "This is the thing. You know me. You know I'm not going to hurt you. I need you to trust me with this one more step, and then we'll have done something nobody thought either of us could do." She kept her voice low and easy. "You ready?" She put her foot in the stirrup. Shadow's ear swiveled to her. His body went slightly still, that contained processing stillness that she had learned to read like a language. He was paying attention. He was deciding. She put her weight into the stirrup. He moved a single shift of weight, a rebalancing, and then he held. She stayed there, weight in the stirrup, not fully up, giving him the time to process the partial weight before she committed to any more of it. And she watched his ears. She watched the muscles along his neck. She watched his breathing. Slow, steady. She swung up. The moment her weight settled fully into the saddle, the ranch went completely silent. The kind of silence that has texture that you can feel in your chest. The silence of people who have stopped, not just talking, but moving, who have been taken out of themselves by what they're witnessing. Shadow stood. He trembled once, a single full-body tremor that moved through him like a wave, and then he breathed a long exhale that she felt through the saddle, and then he stilled. She put her hand on his neck. "There," she said. "There we are." She did not ask him to move. Not yet. She sat in the saddle and let him find his footing with her weight on him. Let him make his peace with it, and he stood in the morning air and breathed, and she breathed, and the trembling did not return. After a minute she clicked softly. Shadow took a step. Then another. She heard despite herself, despite everything she was doing to stay internal and focused. She heard the sound from the fence. Not cheering, not words. Just a sound involuntary, the specific sound that comes out of a person when they've been holding their breath so long that the release of it is audible. She heard Turner make that sound. She heard Danny. She heard Hayes, who she was certain had not made a sound like that in years. She walked Shadow in a slow circle. He moved under her with a deliberateness that wasn't submission. It was never submission, and that was the whole point. It was cooperation. The specific quality of an animal that has chosen to carry you, that has made the sovereign decision to extend its trust to this purpose. And you can feel the difference in every step, because the trust lives in the body, the same way the fear did, and it is nothing like the fear. She brought him back to the center of the corral and stopped, and she sat for a moment in the saddle on the back of the horse that nobody had been able to touch, and she allowed herself privately, internally, in the place that nobody at that fence could see, to feel the full weight of it. The train station. The note. The 11 miles in the wrong shoes. The weeks at the fence in the Montana cold. Her father's voice. The cedar box on the windowsill. All of it had brought her here to this saddle on this horse in this moment. She swung down. Her feet hit the ground, and Shadow turned his head and put his nose against her shoulder, and she put her hand on his face and pressed her forehead briefly against his, and she thought, "You chose this. You chose me, and I chose you right back." She turned around. The fence was full. Every ranch hand. Turner, Danny Cal. The two she still hadn't learned the names of, Ruth Alcott, with her hat still in her hands, and Nathan Hayes, who had come away from the barn doorway and was standing at the corral rail with his hands on the top rail and an expression on his face that she was not going to look at directly right now, because if she did, she was going to come apart in a way she'd been holding together for 3 weeks. Turner was the first one to speak. His voice came out rough, like a man who has been working very hard not to show something and has run out of the strength to keep working at it. "I was wrong," he said. "About all of it. From the first day. I was wrong." Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Hayes opened the gate. She walked out of this corral, and Hayes was there right there. And he looked at her with the expression she had refused to look at directly. And she looked at it now because she was ready, because she'd done what she came to do, and she'd done it without flinching, and she had earned the right to let herself be seen. He said Amelia, just that, her name. But in the way he said it, the weight of those 3 syllables, everything that had accumulated over these weeks pressed into them, she heard everything else. "We need to have a conversation," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, "about what happens when Whitmore arrives." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then something settled in his expression, the capable, decisive look of a man who has just watched something change the terms of his situation and is ready to act accordingly. "Yes," he said, "we do." Behind her, Shadow moved quietly in the corral, unhurried, finding his ease in the morning air, like a horse that has finally arrived somewhere it intended to go. And Amelia Carter, who had arrived in Montana with 2 trunks and a shattered plan and a father's training in her hands, felt the specific solid satisfaction of a woman who has built something real in hard ground, and knows with the bone-deep certainty that no one can take from her exactly what she is worth. The conversation happened that evening at the kitchen table in the main house, which was the first time Nathan Hayes had invited Amelia inside past the barn and the yard. She noticed this without remarking on it, the way she noticed most things, quietly filing it in the place where she kept information that would mean something later. The kitchen was a working kitchen, plain and functional, with the particular organized quality of a man who has learned to keep his own house and has made his peace with the fact that efficiency is not the same as warmth. There were 2 chairs at the table. Hayes put coffee in front of her without asking and sat down across from her and laid his hands flat on the table, which she had come to understand was his version of openness, the gesture of a man making himself available to a difficult conversation. "Whitmore arrives day after tomorrow," he said. "I know. He's going to come in here expecting to see the same situation he saw 2 weeks ago, an unworkable animal and a struggling operation. And instead he's going to see Shadow," she said. "He's going to see Shadow with a saddle and a rider." Hayes paused. "That changes his calculation. I need you to understand how much it changes it. What he was planning to offer me was a fraction of the ranch's value, low enough that I'd clear the debt but walk away with almost nothing. Shadow trained, shadow proven, that changes the valuation entirely." "He won't be happy about that," she said. "No," Hayes said. "He won't. And Whitmore unhappy is a different kind of problem than Whitmore confident. When he came in here 2 weeks ago, he was pleasant. An unhappy Whitmore." He stopped. "He has connections in this county that I don't. He has relationships with the bank that I can't match. If he decides to be difficult about the debt terms, there are ways he can make things harder that don't involve the horse at all." She looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me that showing Shadow might make things worse?" "I'm telling you it might make things more complicated," Hayes said carefully. "There's a difference." "What do you need from me?" He looked at his coffee cup, then at her. "I need you to be there when he arrives. I need you to be the one to show him Shadow, because if I'm the one standing there saying, 'Look what my ranch can do,' he'll dismiss it as a man defending his own territory. But if you—" He paused. "A woman with your father's training behind her, someone who came here specifically because of the horse, someone who has no stake in the financial argument, that's a different kind of testimony." She thought about this carefully. "You want me to be the evidence," she said. "I want you to be what you are," he said, "which is the reason that evidence exists." She was quiet for a moment. Through the window she could hear the ranch settling into evening, the horses in the paddock, the distant sound of the hands finishing up, the particular quality of silence that Montana evenings have when the wind comes down off the mountains and everything goes still. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "You should know that Whitmore spoke to me when he was here last time. Just briefly. He knows who my father is. He's going to do some calculation about what it means that Thomas Carter's daughter is here working with your horse, and depending on what he comes up with, that calculation could go in either direction. Hayes absorbed this. What do you think he'll decide? I think he'll decide it confirms the horse's value, she said, which is either good for us or it makes him want the animal more. The word us sat in the air between them for a moment, quiet and unchallenged. I'd thought of that, Hayes said, about him wanting the horse. And, Shadow's not for sale, he said with a flatness that closed the topic completely. Whatever else happens with this ranch, that animal is not for sale. She looked at him across the table. This careful, proud man with his hands flat on the table and his coffee going cold. And she thought about the first morning she'd arrived at this ranch with her trunk and her father's training and nothing else. And she thought about how much had changed in 3 weeks and how much had not changed at all. How Nathan Hayes had been from the first 5 minutes exactly the person he continued to be, and how rare that was, and how much it mattered. All right, she said. I'll be there when Whitmore arrives, and I'll show him what Shadow can do. Hayes nodded. Nathan, she said. He looked up. Whatever Whitmore decides, whatever he does with the information about Shadow, you should know that you made the right choice. Keeping that horse. Not giving up on him. She paused. Most men would have put him down inside the first month. Something moved in Hayes's expression. Something old and quiet and deep. Margaret wanted me to keep him, he said. She saw him the week before she died. She said, he stopped, collected himself with the practiced discipline of a man who has learned to manage grief by keeping it in specific compartments. She said she thought he was just waiting for the right person to be patient enough. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. She was right, Amelia said quietly. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. She was. She walked back to her room that night, through the cool Montana air, with her hands in her coat pockets and her mind moving through the next 2 days with the methodical attention she brought to anything that mattered. She thought about Whitmore. She thought about the way his eyes had done that rapid recalculation when she'd given him a better answer than he'd expected. She thought about the man he'd sent to watch from the end of the road and what that man had reported back, and whether what Whitmore was coming to verify was the horse's failure or something else entirely. She was almost to the barn when Turner fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming, which was unusual. Turner was not a subtle man in most respects, but he moved quietly when he chose to. You talked to Hayes, he said. Yes. About Whitmore. Yes. Turner was quiet for a few steps. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to let me say it all the way through before you respond, because it's not easy for me to say, and I'm likely to lose my nerve partway through if you interrupt. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. All right, she said. He looked at the ground, then at the sky, then at her, with the determined discomfort of a man doing something that doesn't come naturally. When you came here, he said, I treated you like you were a problem that had shown up on the property. Not a person, a problem. He paused. Part of that was the horse I'd been watching that animal defeat men I respected for 2 years, and I'd made up my mind that the defeat was the horse's final answer, and you walked in saying the answer wasn't final, and that made me... He stopped. It made me look like I'd given up, which I had. And nobody likes being shown where they gave up by someone they've been dismissing. She said nothing. She had promised to let him finish. The other part. Turner continued with the specific, painful effort of a man excavating something he'd rather not look at, was you. Not anything you did. Just who you are. The way you're built. I've been in this work my whole life, and the people who get listened to in this work look a certain way. And you don't look that way, and I made the same mistake. I've watched other people make 100 times without understanding that I was capable of making it myself. He exhaled. That's the honest accounting of it, and I'm sorry. She looked at him in the Montana dark for a moment. Turner, she said, you've been leaving coffee outside my door every morning for 2 weeks. He blinked. That was Briggs. Briggs told me it was you. A pause. Briggs talks too much, Turner said. It was a kind thing, she said. You're a kinder man than you let people see. I think you know that, and I think you've decided it's safer not to let it show, and I understand that decision, even if I don't agree with it. She paused. Apology accepted, Don't apologize again. You've done it right once is enough." Turner looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been seen more accurately than he'd intended and is working out how he feels about it. "Whitmore's going to try something," he said, shifting back to ground that felt more stable. "When he comes, he's not a man who accepts a changed situation gracefully. He'll have a move." "What kind of move?" "I don't know exactly, but I've watched men like him operate for 30 years, and they always have a move that isn't the obvious one. He'll come in, he'll see shadow, he'll adjust his face to look impressed, and then he'll find the angle that the impressive thing doesn't cover." Turner looked at her. "I just want you to be ready for that." "I'm ready for it," she said. "Are you?" "Turner," she said patiently. "I traveled across 4 states to marry a man who sent me a note through his foreman instead of coming to the station himself. I walked 11 miles in the wrong shoes, carrying a trunk to ask a stranger for work. I spent 3 weeks being told I was going to fail by every person on this ranch except the horse." She paused. "I'm ready for Richard Whitmore." Turner made the sound again, the one that was halfway between a laugh and something warmer. "Yes," he said. "I reckon you are." He tipped his hat, a gesture she had learned was as close as Turner came to warmth made visible, and walked back toward the bunkhouse. She stood in the dark for a moment longer, and then went to her room and lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and thought 2 more days. She was at the fence at first light as always. Shadow came to her at the fence, and she climbed in and rode him. Not long, not demanding just the easy confirming motion of an established partnership. The two of them moving together in the early morning with the specific comfort of a relationship that has stopped needing to prove itself and can simply be. She rode him for 30 minutes, then climbed down and stood with him for a while, her hand on his neck, and thought about Ethan Caldwell. She hadn't thought about Ethan Caldwell in several days, which surprised her when she noticed it, because for the weeks before that, she'd thought about him every day, not constantly, not with the obsessive quality of fresh hurt, but the way you think about a wound that is healing, checking on it, assessing its progress. The note in 2 pieces. The 7 years. The cedar box. She had thought about all of it as a kind of accounting, working out what it had cost her and whether she'd paid more than she owed. Standing in the morning light with Shadow, breathing slowly beside her, she understood that she'd stopped doing that accounting. And the cessation of it felt like something significant. She wasn't angry at Ethan Caldwell anymore, not because what he'd done was forgivable. It wasn't not exactly, or at least it didn't need to be excused to be released. He had treated her as something to be managed rather than someone to be known, and that was his failure and his loss, and not a debt she was required to continue paying. He had sent her with his cowardice and his 11 words directly to this corral, this horse, this ranch, these people. If she was angry about that she was angry about the best thing that had ever happened to her. She let it go. She felt it leave the way you feel, a tension in your shoulders release, when you finally stop carrying something you've been carrying so long, you forgot it was there. Shadow put his head against her shoulder. "Yeah," she said. "I know." Whitmore arrived the following morning at 10 o'clock with 2 associates and a banker from Billings. She hadn't expected a thin man named Hoskins, who carried a leather satchel and wore the expression of a man who has attended many of these meetings and long since stopped having feelings about them. Hayes met them in the yard. Amelia stayed near the barn, where she could see everything without being the first thing Whitmore looked at. Turner was visible near the paddock working with deliberate normalcy. Danny was doing fence repair with the careful focus of someone performing normalcy rather than feeling it. Whitmore shook Hayes's hand with the same elaborate warmth as before, and Hayes received it with the same careful control, and the 2 men stood in the yard and did the specific performance of cordial negotiation that both of them understood was a performance. "I appreciate you making the trip," Hayes said. Of course. Whitmore looked around the yard with the appraising sweep she remembered. His eyes found Amelia near the barn. They registered her, and something moved in his expression, a brief recalibration quickly smoothed. "Miss Carter," he said across the yard. "Still here." "Still here," she said pleasantly. He turned back to Hayes. "I thought we'd take a look at the operation first, have a conversation about the terms, and then—" I thought we'd start with the horse, Hayes said. A beat. Whitmore's pleasant expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention did. The horse, he said. Shadow, Hayes said. Since he's the primary point of contention, I thought we'd start there and let the numbers follow the reality. Whitmore looked at Hayes for a moment. The banker Hoskins made a small note in a book he produced from somewhere with the reflexive efficiency of a man who takes notes on everything. All right, Whitmore said. The horse. They walked to the far corral. The entire ranch seemed to slow as they walked. Amelia felt it the held quality of the air, the way Danny's fence repair became very precise and very focused, without advancing the way. Turner didn't turn around from the paddock, but didn't move either. Shadow was in the corral. He saw them coming and stood his head up, watching the approach, not with the panicked alertness of 3 weeks ago, but with the calm, evaluating attention he now brought to the world, the attention of an animal that had renegotiated its relationship with humans and was still making decisions about each new human on an individual basis. Whitmore stopped at the fence rail. He looked at the horse. He looked at it for a long time, and she watched Whitmore's face with the same quality of attention she'd been trained to bring to horses, reading the signals, the micro-expressions, the adjustments. He was recalculating. Whatever he'd come here expecting to confirm, this was not it. Shadow was not the same animal. Even without the saddle, even standing still, the quality of his presence had changed fundamentally. The nervous, wound-tight energy was gone, replaced by something that was clearly and immediately legible as an animal in possession of itself. Calm, present, watchful, without being frightened. He looks different, Whitmore said carefully. He is different, Hayes said. How different? Hayes looked at Amelia. She stepped forward, and Shadow's attention shifted immediately to her, the specific personal quality of attention that he gave her, and nobody else, the quality that was impossible to fake and impossible to miss. Let me show you, she said. She went over the fence, not through the gate, over the rail, with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this space. And Shadow walked toward her, with the unrushed, deliberate movement of an animal choosing its company. She put her hand on his neck and looked at Whitmore. Whitmore's jaw was set. The pleasant expression was still in place, but the eyes behind it were doing rapid, complex work. She saddled Shadow in front of them. Each step smooth, each transition accepted Shadow, standing with the patience of an animal that has made its peace with this process. She felt Hoskins the banker stop writing at some point and just watch. She mounted. Shadow stood, accepted. Her weight breathed. She walked him in a circle. A figure 8 brought him back to the center. The banker said very quietly, "I'll be." Whitmore said nothing. She dismounted, ran a hand down Shadow's neck, and climbed back over the fence. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. Then Whitmore turned to Hayes, and the pleasant expression was gone, and in its place was something Amelia hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, but a kind of stripped-back directness that was almost more honest than the pleasantness had ever been. "What do you want?" Whitmore said. "Fair terms on the debt," Hayes said. 12 months to clear it at reasonable interest. No early purchase option, no right of first refusal on the property. "You're asking me to give up my leverage." "I'm asking you to give me a fair chance," Hayes said. "Which is different." Whitmore looked at Hoskins. Some communication passed between them that Amelia couldn't entirely read, but that seemed to be about numbers rather than strategy. Then Whitmore looked at her. "Miss Carter," he said, "what's your arrangement with Hayes?" She met his eyes. "Ranch work, she said. "Horse training, fair wage. And after, when this is settled, I have other inquiries to consider," she said, thinking of Ruth Alcott and her steady, direct gaze. "I'm sure you do," Whitmore said. He looked back at Hayes. He was very quiet for a moment, in the way of a man making a genuine calculation rather than a strategic one. "I'm going to tell you something honestly, Hayes, because I think it's owed." Hayes waited. "I've been trying to acquire this property for 2 years, Whitmore said. "Not because the operation was failing, I could see it was struggling, but I've seen struggling operations turn themselves around before, and this land is worth more than the difficulty. I pushed where I could push, because that's what I do." He paused. "I wasn't expecting this." He gestured toward the corral toward Shadow. Nobody was, Hayes said. The woman you hired. Whitmore glanced at Amelia. She's done something here that I didn't think was possible, and I think you know what that changes. It changes the valuation, Hayes said. It changes more than the valuation, Whitmore said. It changes the story of this ranch, and a story is worth money in ways that a valuation doesn't fully capture. He exhaled one long, deliberate breath. I'll give you your 12 months, standard interest, no purchase option. He paused. But I want it in writing that if you do decide to sell within 5 years, I get first conversation. First conversation, Hayes said. Not first refusal. First conversation, Whitmore confirmed. Hayes looked at him for a moment. Then he put out his hand. That's fair, he said. They shook hands. Hoskins began writing immediately with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has learned to document agreements before the parties have time to reconsider. Amelia stood slightly apart from all of this and felt the specific quality of a held breath releasing not just hers, but the ranch's, the accumulated tension of weeks resolving itself in the handshake of two men at a corral fence. She felt Turner come to stand beside her again, as he had taken to doing at significant moments, and she didn't look at him, but she was aware of his presence, the way you're aware of solid ground. First conversation, Turner said quietly. Not bad. Not bad, she agreed. Whitmore, in the process of reviewing what Hoskins had written, looked up and caught her eye. He held it for a moment, and in his expression was something she hadn't expected, something that might in a different man have been respect, and even in this man was at least its approximation. He tipped his hat. She nodded. That was enough. When Whitmore and his party left an hour later, the ranch exhaled collectively. Danny Reeves actually let out a sound that was half cheer, quickly suppressed, and Cal Briggs shook Hayes's hand without ceremony and went back to work because Cal Briggs expressed himself through returning to work. Hayes came to find Amelia where she was back at the corral, not inside it, just at the fence, watching Shadow move. The stallion was himself again, the visitors gone, the pressure of the morning dissolving as horse's pressure does cleanly and without residue. 12 months, Hayes said, coming to stand beside her. 12 months, she said. Ruth Alcott's inquiry, he said carefully. You said you had other inquiries to consider. I do, she said. But you didn't say you were leaving. She looked at the horse. No, she said. I didn't say that. Hayes was quiet for a moment. I'd like to propose a formal arrangement, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has been constructing something in his mind for some time and has decided the construction is complete enough to present. A partnership. You manage the training operation Shadow and any future animals we bring on. We split the training fees and the improved valuation of the stock. He paused. Ruth Alcott isn't the only rancher in this territory who's heard what you've done here. This could be something real, Amelia. Something built. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horse, not at her, with the particular careful attention of a man who is saying something significant and is managing his vulnerability by not making it too direct. A partnership, and she said. A real one, he said. Not charity, not a job, something equal. She thought about her father in Salina at the kitchen table, coffee cup in hand. You've known his letters 7 years, Amelia. That ain't always the same thing. She thought about what she'd learned about the difference between knowing a person's words and knowing a person. She thought about 3 weeks of fence rails and cold mornings, and a man who left coffee outside her door, and a man who gave her his half-full cup, and a boy who wrote things down in a notebook to remember them. She thought about what it felt like to know where you were supposed to be. I'll need a contract, she said. Written terms. Not because I don't trust you, but because my father raised me to know that trust and a written contract are not competing things. Hayes turned to look at her then, and in his expression was the specific quality of a man hearing exactly what he needed to hear in exactly the way he needed to hear it. Your father sounds like a wise man, he said. Hi is, she said. You'd like him. I suspect I would, Hayes said. He paused. Amelia. When this is settled, the contract, the arrangement, all of it sorted out properly, I'd like to write to your father. She looked at him. To tell him about the partnership. He held her gaze. To start, he said. The word to start settled in the air between them, with the weight and the warmth of something she had stopped letting herself expect. The specific solid warmth of a thing that is real, rather than promised earned, rather than offered chosen freely on both sides. He'd write back, she said finally. He's particular about who he writes to, but he'd write back to you. Hayes nodded the nod of a man who has been told something he intended to deserve. It was Turner later that afternoon who found her with an envelope. She was in the barn, and he came in with the particular set of his shoulders that told her he was working up to something, and she waited. He held out the envelope. This came with Whitmore's party, he said. One of his men gave it to Hoskins to give to me. I don't know how it got there. His voice was controlled in a way that told her the control was deliberate. She took the envelope. Her name was on the front in handwriting she recognized. Her stomach tightened once hard and then released. She opened it. It was from Ethan Caldwell. Not long. Half a page in the slanted handwriting she'd once read in a cedar box. He had heard she was in Montana. Word traveled in the territory she knew that. And he had heard about the horse and the Hayes Ranch. And he had written to say the phrasing was careful and worked over, in the way of a man who has practiced his humility, rather than feeling it that he was glad she had landed on her feet, and that he wanted her to know he had made a mistake, and that if she wished to, she stopped reading. She refolded the letter along its crease. She looked at it in her hand for a moment, this piece of paper from a man she had loved through letters for 7 years, and she thought about how much she had once valued the envelopes that came from him. The cedar box on the windowsill. The patience she had extended across states and seasons, because she had believed that the letters were the man. She had learned something better. She crossed to the small stove in the corner of the barn, opened it, and put the letter inside. Turner watched all of this without a word. She closed the stove and dusted her hands against her skirt and turned around. Gone, Turner said. Gone, she said. He studied her face for a moment, checking something. You all right? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. Yes, she said. More than all right. Turner looked at her for a moment longer, with the look she had learned to read as his version of warmth, the specific, restrained, genuine warmth of a man who has decided you are worth caring about and is not entirely sure what to do with that decision. Good, he said. He picked up a brush and went back to the horse he'd been working, and that was Turner's version of a benediction, and she accepted it as such. She went to the window and looked out at the far corral. Shadow was standing in the afternoon light, unhurried and present, his head up, watching something in the distance that only he could see. He stood the way he had not stood when she arrived, loose and unguarded, the body of an animal that has stopped bracing for the next bad thing, that has dared to believe the bad things are behind it. She understood him completely. She had stopped bracing too, outside the window. Nathan Hayes crossed the yard toward the house, and he paused halfway across and looked toward the barn. And when he found her in the window, something in his expression shifted, warm and careful and real, the face of a man who has learned the same lesson. The horse learned that trust has to be chosen, and that choosing it is not weakness, but the specific, rare courage of someone who has been hurt enough to know what it costs, and has decided the cost is worth it. He tipped his hat. She put her hand to the window glass, and that she thought was the beginning of the thing that actually lasts. The contract took 4 days to write, not because the terms were complicated. They were straightforward, and Hayes had been straightforward in every particular, exactly as she'd expected him to be, but because Amelia insisted on reading every line 3 times, and because Thomas Carter's daughter did not sign documents she hadn't fully understood, and because the attorney Hayes brought in from Billings, a dry, careful man named Aldous Greer, kept trying to insert language that softened the word partnership into something that looked more like employment with better wages. And each time he did, she caught it. And each time she caught it, Hayes looked at Greer with an expression that required no translation, and Greer removed the language, and eventually Greer stopped trying. The final document said what it meant. Equal split on training fees. Equal voice on which animals the operation took on. Her name beside Hayes's on the letterhead of what was now formally called the Carter-Hayes Training Operation, which had been Hayes's suggestion, and which she had accepted with the specific quiet pleasure of hearing her name placed first not as courtesy, but as accuracy. She had built this alongside him, and the name reflected that. She signed it on a Thursday morning at the kitchen table, Hayes across from her, Greer at the end with his witnesses. Turner standing in the doorway, because Turner had been asked to witness and had arrived 20 minutes early without acknowledging that he'd arrived early. When both signatures were on the document, Greer gathered his papers and excused himself with professional efficiency. Turner shook Hayes's hand, then looked at Amelia and did something she had never seen him do in the 6 weeks she'd known him. He smiled. A real one, not the tight, controlled acknowledgement she'd catalogued before, but something genuine and wide that changed his whole face into something younger and far less defended. "Carter Hayes," he said. "That's got a ring to it." "It does," she said. He put out his hand to her. She shook it. "I'm going to say one more thing," he said, "and then I'm going to go back to work, and we're never going to discuss it again." "All right," she said. "You're the best I've ever seen," he said. "With a horse, with people, with a situation. I've worked alongside men with 40 years in this business, and I've never seen anyone with your instinct." He paused. "That's the thing I should have said the first day, instead of what I did say." She looked at him steadily. "Say it again the first day you have a new hand who you're inclined to dismiss," she said. "That would be the right use of it." He held her gaze for a moment. "Fair," he said. Then he tipped his hat and walked out the door, and true to his word, he never brought it up again, and that was exactly right. The letter to Thomas Carter went out that same Thursday. Hayes wrote it himself at the kitchen table after Amelia had gone to the barn for evening feeding. She knew he was writing it because Danny had seen him through the window and reported this with the innocent transparency of a 20-year-old who doesn't yet understand that some information is meant to travel and some isn't. She appreciated the information and said nothing about it, because there are some things a person needs to do without an audience, and writing to a woman's father is one of them. She wrote her own letter to her father the same evening, sitting on the edge of her cot with the lamp turned high. She told him about the ranch. She told him about Shadow in the way that she thought he would want to hear it, the details of the method, what she'd observed, where she'd adjusted, what the horse had taught her that she hadn't expected to learn. She told him that his training had been the foundation of everything. Then she told him about Nathan Hayes. Not everything. Not the coffee cup, not the window, not the hat tip in the yard that had said more than most conversations she'd ever had. But enough. Enough that Thomas Carter, who had known his daughter since before she had language for what she knew, would read between the careful lines and understand. She ended the letter. "I think you were right that I didn't know him from his letters. But I know him now, Papa. And I think you will too." She folded it and sealed it and set it on the trunk to go out in the morning, and she sat for a long time in the lamplight, listening to the ranch at night, and feeling in her chest, in her hands, in the particular quality of her breathing, the specific weight of a life that has found its right shape. The first outside client arrived 11 days after the contract was signed. Ruth Alcott, as promised, came directly and without ceremony, riding in on a gray mare with two of her hands and a young bay gelding on a lead line that was moving with the coiled, fractious energy of an animal that had decided the world was against it. "This is Copper," Ruth said, swinging down with the ease of a woman who has been getting on and off horses for 60 years. "He's 4. Previous owner got him cheap because nobody could get a saddle on him without a fight. I bought him because the bloodlines are exceptional, and I thought—" She paused, looking at the gelding with the honest assessment of someone who has revised her certainty somewhat since the purchase. "I thought I could manage him. I was optimistic." Amelia walked to the gelding and stood at the edge of his awareness, not approaching, just present. Copper's ears went flat, then forward, then sideways, in the rapid, indecisive pattern of a young animal that hasn't yet sorted its fear into a consistent response. "How long have you had him?" she asked. 3 months, Ruth said. "He's gotten worse, not better. My headman tried twice, and the second time, Copper put him through a fence." "Is the man all right?" "Wounded pride mostly," Ruth said dryly. "He'll recover." Amelia looked at the gelding. I was watching her now, not with the layered, complex watchfulness that Shadow had had, which was the watchfulness of an animal that had been profoundly hurt, but with the simpler, more manageable wariness of a young horse that hadn't yet learned how to be afraid of the right things. 2 weeks, she said. Ruth looked at her. 2 weeks, she repeated. Maybe less. He's young enough that the patterns aren't fixed. She paused. But I won't rush it. Ruth Alcott looked at the gelding, then at Amelia, with the expression of a woman performing a rapid and experienced evaluation. Hayes tells me what you did with Shadow, she said. I saw some of it myself that morning. I know, Amelia said. I saw you at the fence. I don't impress easily, Ruth said. I know that too, Amelia said. Ruth almost smiled. 2 weeks, she said. And I'll pay your rate for the full month whether it takes that long or not, because I suspect you'll have earned it either way. She handed the lead line to one of her hands and turned back to her mare. I'll be back in a fortnight. Take good care of him. Ma'am, Amelia said. Ruth Alcott paused, one hand on her horse. Thank you for coming to me first. Ruth looked at her for a moment, with the direct, unglamorous steadiness that Amelia had come to associate with women who had built things in difficult places. Women who do this kind of work need to hold each other up, she said simply. That's not sentiment, that's just good sense. She mounted and rode out, her hands following, and the gelding watched them go, and then looked at Amelia with the resigned uncertainty of an animal that has just been left in a new situation and doesn't know what to make of it. Easy, she told him. You're going to be fine. Danny was at her elbow almost immediately. He had the notebook out. What are you going to do different with him than with Shadow? He asked. Observe then decide, she said. Same as always. Every horse tells you what it needs if you listen before you act. She looked at him. Write that down. He already had. Hayes appeared from the direction of the house. He'd watched the arrival from a distance. She knew he watched most things from a distance first, assessing before engaging, which was a quality she had come to find not cautious, but intelligent. First client, he said. First client, she confirmed. How does it feel? She looked at the gelding, who was now sniffing the fence post with the exploratory interest of a young animal that has decided provisionally that catastrophe is not immediately imminent. Like the beginning of something, she said. Hayes stood beside her in the easy, undemonstrative way he had when he was most comfortable, present without making a production of it, companionable without requiring acknowledgement. She had come to value this quality in him more than she could have anticipated when she arrived, because she had spent much of her life in the company of people who needed their presence noted and returned. And there was a specific quiet relief in standing beside someone who simply was there, who didn't need the standing beside to be remarked upon. I heard back from Billings, he said after a moment. The Cattlemen's Association. They want to know if we'll take on horses from the spring drive that need retraining. 12 animals, potentially more. She turned to look at him. 12. The foreman I spoke to said he's heard about Shadow from 3 different ranchers in the past 2 weeks. Word travels, Hayes said with the specific, careful satisfaction of a man who has seen something he worked for begin to compound. We'll need more hands, she said immediately. If we're taking on 12 animals alongside Alcott's gelding and Shadow's ongoing work. I've been thinking about that, he said. Danny's ready for more responsibility. And Turner. He paused. Turner's been watching everything I do with Shadow for 6 weeks, she said. He's been adjusting his approach with the paddock horses for 2 weeks. He hasn't said anything about it because he's Turner, but he's learning. Hayes looked at her. You noticed. I notice everything, she said. That's the job. He looked at the gelding, then back at her. I'd like to have that conversation with Turner, he said, about expanding his role, if you're comfortable with it. More than comfortable, she said. Turner is a good horseman. He was a good horseman before I arrived. He just needed to see that there was a different way. She paused. Don't tell him I said that. He'd be insufferable, Hayes agreed. Completely insufferable, she said. They were both quiet for a moment, and it was the particular quality of quiet that had been developing between them since the contract, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of things to say, and everything to do with the presence of something that didn't need to be said constantly to be understood. My daughter is visiting next month, Hayes said. It was casual in the way that important information is sometimes delivered, casually slipped into the ordinary stream of a conversation like a stone into water, waiting for the ripple. She was careful with her response. How old is she? 16. She's been at school in Helena since... He stopped. Since her mother died. She comes in the summers mostly. He paused. I've written to her about the ranch, about what's happened here. What did you tell her? The truth, he said. About Shadow, about the partnership, about... He stopped again, and this second stop had a different quality, more deliberate, the stop of a man choosing his next words, rather than waiting for them to arrive. About the fact that things are different here than they were. She looked at him sidelong. Different how? He turned to look at her directly, and Nathan Hayes looking at her directly was still 6 weeks in something that required a specific internal steadiness to receive because of the quality of it. The unhidden, careful, real quality of the man who has decided not to protect himself from this particular thing. Better, he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and in the holding of it, she understood that this was one of the moments that would matter later. One of the ones you return to when you are trying to locate exactly where a thing became certain. I'd like to meet her, she said. I know, he said. She wants to meet you. Something warm and specific moved through her chest, and she let it. She had learned these past weeks to let the good things move through her without immediately building defenses against them. That had been the hardest relearning of all, harder than Shadow, harder than Whitmore, harder than Turner. Learning that something being real didn't mean it would be taken away. Write and tell her I'm looking forward to it, she said. He nodded. He would. The weeks that followed moved with the productive, purposeful quality of a thing that has found its rhythm. Copper Ruth Alcott's gelding responded inside 10 days faster than she'd projected, because he was young and the fear wasn't as embedded as it might have been with more time. The breakthrough with him was quieter than Shadow's had been, less dramatic, which was fine. Not everything that mattered had to be witnessed by a crowd. She led him out of the corral on a halter. On the 11th day, and walked him around the yard in a slow, easy circle, and he walked beside her like an animal that had decided the world was navigable after all, and she thought, yes. This is what I'm for. Turner watched from the fence. Alcott's going to be pleased, he said. He's a good horse, she said. He just needed someone to believe that before he did. Turner was quiet for a moment. Miss Carter, he said. Amelia, she said. They'd established this 2 weeks ago, but Turner still defaulted to formality when he was preparing to say something important. Amelia, he said. Hayes spoke to me. About the expanded operation. About taking on a larger role in the training program. He paused. I told him I'd need to hear from you directly, that it was something you wanted. She looked at him. It's something I want, she said. You're the best natural horseman on this ranch, Turner. What you've been missing is the framework. You've been watching me long enough now that you have more of it than you think. He absorbed this with the careful, slightly pained expression of a man receiving a compliment and not knowing where to put it. I'd want to do it right, he said. Not just manage the regular stock. I'd want to actually learn your father's method, what you know. Then learn it, she said. I'll teach you. Same way my father taught me, alongside, not above. You'll make mistakes. So did I. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. After everything I said when you arrived. Why would you? Because the ranch needs you, she said. And because you changed. Most people don't. She paused. And because my father always said the best students are the ones who were wrong first and know it. Turner turned away, looking at the paddock, because Turner processed emotion by looking at something else and giving himself a moment. All right, he said. When he turned back, his voice restored to its usual measured quality. All right then. Monday, she said. We start Monday. Monday, he confirmed, and tipped his hat and went back to work. The letter from Thomas Carter arrived on a Friday 3 weeks after she'd sent hers. She recognized his handwriting from the porch of the main house where she'd been reviewing the Cattle Association proposal with Hayes, and something happened in her chest when she saw it, a particular specific warmth that was the feeling of home arriving in your hands. From your father, Hayes said. Yes. She looked at the envelope. You're waiting to hear whether he wrote to you separately. Hayes said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. He did, she said. He told me he would. He writes his letters in a particular order. Mine first because I'm his daughter. Then any others. She looked at Hayes. Give him another week. I'm not in any hurry, Hayes said with the specific, careful nonchalance of a man who is entirely in a hurry. She opened her letter and read it there because her father had never written anything to her that she'd been unable to share, and because Hayes had put his name beside hers on a piece of paper, and that meant something. Thomas Carter wrote the way he spoke directly with feeling contained in the precision of the language rather than spilled over the edges of it. He wrote about Shadow with the attentive interest of a professional encountering a problem solved in a way he hadn't tried, asking specific questions about her approach to the initial trust-building, noting where he would have done it differently and why he thought her way might actually have been better. He wrote in about the partnership with the particular careful approval of a father who has decided provisionally that the person his daughter is building something with is worth trusting while reserving the right to complete his assessment in person. He wrote near the end, You found your place, Amelia. I always knew you would. I just didn't know it would be so far from home. I think that says something about the size of what you were meant to do. And at the very end, in the measured, deliberate phrasing of a man who loves his daughter enough to be honest with her. I think I'd like to come to Montana sometime and meet this man who was wise enough to give his horse to you and smart enough to keep you afterward. A man who knows what he has when he has it is not a common thing. She folded the letter and looked at Hayes, who had been conspicuously examining the cattleman's proposal with great interest. He says you're not a common thing, she said. Hayes looked up. He said that about me. He said a man who knows what he has is not a common thing. The implication was clear. Hayes was quiet for a moment, and she watched something move through him, the specific, unguarded quality of a man being told something he hadn't let himself fully hope for. He wants to come to Montana, she said, to meet you. Hayes set the proposal down. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, and then he looked at her with the direct, unhidden look that she had come to understand was his version of openness at its maximum, the look he kept for the things that mattered most. I'd like that, he said. Very much. Good, she said. Because I told him you would. The summer moved forward. 12 horses arrived from the Cattlemen's Association over 3 weeks in groups of 3 and 4. Each animal, a new problem and a new conversation and a new set of signals to learn and respond to. Danny Reeves worked beside her with the focused, earnest diligence of someone who has found his calling and knows it. His notebook filling with observations that were. She was coming to understand, genuinely insightful. The instinct was there, buried under youth and inexperience, and given the right conditions. It was surfacing with the confidence of something that had been waiting. You're going to be good at this, she told him one afternoon when he'd correctly read the shift in a nervous mare 20 minutes before the animal's behavior would have made it obvious to anyone else. He looked at her. You think so? I know so, she said. I've been watching you as long as you've been watching me. He considered this with the serious, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving information that reorganizes their sense of themselves. I didn't think, he started. I didn't think I had any particular... Danny, she said patiently. The notebook. He looked down at the notebook in his shirt pocket. You've been recording everything you observe for 6 weeks, she said. Not because someone told you to, because you needed to. Because you couldn't not observe and couldn't not record it. That's not something you learn, that's something you are. She paused. What you need to learn is the method, and you've already started. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, Miss Carter, did anyone tell you that you were good at this before you figured it out yourself? She thought about her father, the fence rail, the gray mare, the particular patience with which Thomas Carter had stood beside her for 15 years and watched her become something. Yes, she said. I had someone who showed me what it looked like when someone believed in you before you'd earned it. That's why I know what it looks like. Danny wrote something in the notebook. She didn't ask what. The twist arrived as twists do from the direction you weren't watching. It was Hayes who brought her the newspaper 3 weeks into the cattleman's contract on a Saturday morning when the ranch was moving at its weekend pace, and she was working with one of the association horses in the near paddock. He came across the yard with the paper folded in his hand, and the expression of a man who has read something and needs to decide how to present it. She stopped what she was doing. "What is it?" she said. He held out the paper. She took it. The article was on the third page in the regional news section, a short piece about a horse operation in Wyoming that had collapsed following a lawsuit from a former client. The client's claim was that a horse trained by the operation had been represented as fully compliant and had subsequently injured the client's rider. She read it twice. "I don't understand," she said. "Why are you—" "Keep reading," he said. Near the bottom of the article, a quote from the Wyoming operation's former lead trainer who had left 6 months before the lawsuit and whose opinion had been solicited by the reporter as context. The trainer was named in the article. She read the name. She read it again. Jack Turner, Cheyenne, Wyoming, before he came to the Hayes Ranch. She lowered the paper slowly. "He left that operation 6 months before the lawsuit," Hayes said. "I checked. There's no claim against him personally. The suit was against the operation's owner who had been misrepresenting training outcomes to clients." He paused. Turner left because he knew what was happening and refused to continue being part of it. She was quiet for a moment, processing this, running it against everything she knew about Turner. The resistance, the defensiveness about his methods, the specific anger of a man who has seen something done wrong and has been implicated by proximity. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said. "No," Hayes said. "But he carries it. Whatever happened there?" He paused. "I thought you should know. Because you're asking him to take on a larger role. And because I think he should probably know that you know." She looked at Hayes. "You think I should talk to him?" "I think you'll handle it better than I will," he said simply. She found Turner in the barn that afternoon, doing what Turner did when he was working through something methodical, repetitive physical work, the kind that doesn't require thought, and therefore gives the mind room to go where it needs to go. He was cleaning tack with the focused efficiency of a man cleaning tack who is not thinking about the tack. She sat down on a hay bale nearby. She said nothing for a moment. Turner did not acknowledge her presence, which meant he'd heard her come in and had decided to let her open whatever she'd come to open. "Wyoming," she said. Turner's hand stopped, then resumed. "Hayes told you." "He showed me the article. My name's in it." It was a statement, not a question. "Near the bottom," she said. As someone who left before the lawsuit, as someone the reporter asked for context. "What did it say?" "That you refused to continue working for an operation that was misrepresenting its outcomes." She paused. "That's what it said, Turner." He was very still for a moment, the tack in his hands. Then he set it down carefully and looked at her. The owner, he said, was telling clients their horses were fully trained when they weren't, taking money for work that hadn't been done to the standard he'd claimed. "I knew it and I said so, and he told me to mind my work and keep my mouth shut." He paused. "I left. I should have done more than leave. I should have gone to someone. But I didn't, and a rider got hurt, and that's something I carry." "You were doing the right thing as best you knew how," she said. "The right thing wasn't enough," he said. "Someone got hurt." She was quiet for a moment. "Turner," she said carefully, "is that why you pushed back so hard when I arrived? Because you'd seen someone misrepresent their abilities with horses, and it cost someone?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Partly," he said. "And partly—" He stopped. "Partly, I was ashamed. Of the Wyoming thing. And you were coming in here talking about a different way of doing things, and all I could think was that the last person who came in talking about a different way of doing things had been the owner in Wyoming, and he'd been wrong, and people had paid for it." He paused. "I know that's not fair. You're not him. You never were." "No," she said. "But I understand the mechanism. When you've been burned by a thing, the outline of the thing triggers the fear even when the thing itself is different." Turner looked at her with something that moved between them that was older and less armored than anything that had passed between them before. "Like shadow," he said quietly. "Like shadow, she confirmed. How was quiet for a long time. I've been thinking about going back, he said. To Wyoming. Not to the operation it's gone, but to find the family of the rider who was hurt. To say... He stopped. I don't know what I'd say, but I think I need to say something. She looked at him steadily. I think that's right, she said. And I think you should do it. Take the time you need. The operation. We'll be here when you come back, she said. Danny is ready for more responsibility than he's been given, and you'll come back better for having done it. Turner looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his expression was the specific quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told by someone they trust that they can put it down. You're a strange woman, Amelia Carter, he said. So I've been told, she said. He picked up the tack and resumed his work, and she sat on the hay bale a while longer, and the barn was quiet around them, with the specific productive quiet of a place where real things are built and real things are faced. Hayes's daughter arrived on the second Thursday in August. Her name was Clara, and she came off the stage with the particular self-conscious composure of a 16-year-old who is working very hard to appear unbothered by something she is extremely bothered by, which in Clara's case turned out to be the fact that she was nervous about meeting Amelia, and had not wanted to be nervous, and was therefore applying composure like a solution to a problem. Amelia recognized this immediately and liked her for it. Hayes made the introduction with the careful warmth of a man who has prepared for this moment without letting himself think too carefully about how much it mattered, and Clara put out her hand with the deliberateness of someone who has been told that Amelia Carter is someone you shake hands with properly. My father says you're the one who fixed Shadow, Clara said. Shadow fixed himself, Amelia said. I just gave him the conditions. Clara looked at her. She had her father's eyes, the same dark measuring quality, the same intelligence that didn't hurry itself. Can I meet him? She said. Shadow. After lunch, Amelia said. On his terms. Clara nodded with the serious consideration of someone filing this information as important. He told me, she said, meaning her father, that you came here with nothing and built everything. He didn't say it like that. He said it more, he was trying not to be sentimental about it. But that was what he meant. He's not wrong about the nothing part, Amelia said. He's not wrong about the everything part either, Clara said with the flat directness of a teenager speaking a truth she hasn't yet learned to soften, and then immediately looked as though she'd surprised herself with her own candor. Amelia looked at this girl, 16 years old, her mother 4 years gone, boarding school in Helena, coming home to a father and a ranch that had changed substantially since she'd last been here, and she thought about what it must be like to arrive to all of this, and she made a decision. Clara, she said, would you like to work with me while you're here? Clara blinked. Work with you. With the horses, the training. Not as an observer, as someone actually learning the work. She paused. If you want to. Clara looked at her father, who was watching this exchange with the carefully neutral expression of a man who will be whatever Clara needs him to be, but is privately hoping very hard. Then she looked back at Amelia. Yes, she said with a conviction that was not performed. Yes, I'd like that very much. Hayes. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, stood on the porch with Amelia in the cool August dark and said nothing for a long time, which was one of the things she had come to most value about him, that he understood the specific, irreplaceable value of silence between people who have things to say to each other. Thank you, he said finally, for what you offered her. She's remarkable, Amelia said. She's got your instinct for reading things. That's not taught. Her mother's, he said. Margaret had that, the reading of things. He paused. Clara doesn't talk about her often. Not because she doesn't miss her, she does enormously, but because... He stopped. Because for a long time this ranch was the place where her mother wasn't, and now... He stopped again. Now it's a place where things grow, Amelia said quietly. He looked at her in the dark. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. She felt him turn toward her slightly, and she turned toward him, and what happened then was not dramatic, was not the sudden flourishing thing of stories told at second hand. It was the specific earned intentional movement of two people who have been taking their time with a thing and have reached the moment when more time serves no purpose except to protect them from what they've already decided. He put his hand on hers where it rested on the porch rail. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood like that in the Montana dark, the ranch around them. Shadow in the far corral, breathing slow and easy. Clara asleep inside Turner's bunkhouse, light still on. Danny probably writing in his notebook, and all of it. The specific, solid, earned reality of something built from the hardest materials. She thought about the train station. The note in 2 pieces, the 11 miles, the fence rail in the cold morning, the coffee cup handed over without a word, the name Carter Hayes in ink on a piece of paper. She thought about her father's letter. A man who knows what he has when he has it is not a common thing. Nathan, she said. Yes, he said, and he wasn't answering the word she'd spoken. He was answering what was underneath it the way he always answered the thing underneath, carefully, directly, without pretense. I'm staying, she said. I want you to know that. Not because of the contract, because this is where I'm supposed to be. His hand tightened on hers. I know, he said. I've known for a while. How long, she said. Howe was quiet for a moment, and she thought she could feel him smiling in the dark, which was something she hadn't seen enough of yet, and intended to remedy. Since the morning I gave you my coffee cup, he said. She laughed, the one that came from genuine surprise, the one she'd first found with Danny and the notebook. And Nathan Hayes laughed beside her, low and warm, the laugh of a man coming back to a version of himself he'd thought he'd lost. The Thomas Carter visit was arranged for September. He arrived on a Tuesday with a good trunk and a better coat, and the particular quality of presence that belonged to men who had spent their lives working with things that required patience and attention. A settled, unrushed quality. The quality of someone who is always exactly where they mean to be. Amelia met him at the stage. When she saw him come down the steps, she felt the specific, irreducible emotion of a daughter seeing her father in a new place. The strangeness of someone who belongs to your oldest self, existing in the context of your newest self. The particular joy and vulnerability of showing someone who loves you the life you've built without them. He pulled her into a hug that was her father's hug, solid, no-nonsense, brief enough to not embarrass either of them, warm enough to say everything. You look well, he said, holding her at arm's length and looking at her the way he looked at everything, thoroughly, without agenda. I am well, she said. I can see that, he said. That's different from you telling me. He met Hayes that afternoon, and she watched from a careful distance, because there are some meetings a daughter does not need to manage, and this was one of them. She watched them shake hands. She watched the first 5 minutes of conversation, which she couldn't hear, but could read in the posture and the pace of it. 2 men who have both built things from difficult ground, finding the language of that common territory. She went to check on Shadow. He came to the fence when she arrived, as he always did, now without hesitation, without the long assessment. Simply came because she had come, because that was the arrangement between them, freely entered on both sides. She climbed the fence and stood with him, her hand on his neck. My father's here, she told him. He's going to want to meet you. Shadow breathed slowly against her shoulder. You'll like him, she said. He's patient. He listens before he talks. He knows what he's looking at. She paused. You two have more in common than you'd think. That evening, Thomas Carter came to the corral before supper. He stood at the fence for a long time watching Shadow, and Shadow watched him back with the careful, evaluating attention. He now gave all new people, not fear, but assessment. The specific intelligence of an animal making its own decisions about the world. Thomas Carter said nothing for a long time. Then Shadow walked toward the fence. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at Thomas Carter directly, and Thomas Carter looked back, and the old horseman from Salina, Kansas, said very quietly, Well, there you are. And Shadow, who had been written off by every capable hand in Montana, who had been the emblem of an impossible problem, lowered his head toward Thomas Carter's outstretched hand. Thomas looked at his daughter over the fence. She saw in his face everything she needed to see. The professional acknowledgement, the fatherly pride, the specific satisfaction of a man who has watched a person he loves do something genuinely difficult and do it completely right. "You did good, Amelia," he said. It was the sentence she'd been hearing from him her whole life, calibrated precisely, never given lightly, worth everything each time. "I had a good teacher," she said. He shook his head once. "You had a teacher," he said. "What you have is your own." At supper that night, Hayes, Thomas Carter, Clara Turner, who'd been invited and had accepted with the gruff pleasure of a man who'd stopped pretending he didn't want to be included. She looked around the table and thought about what it had taken to arrive here. The years of letters, the station platform, the cold mornings, the fence rail, the saddle, the contract, the coffee cup. All of it leading with the inexorable logic of things that are meant to this table, this food, this particular assembly of people who had built something together in hard ground. Turner was telling Thomas Carter about the Wyoming operation, which surprised her, and Thomas Carter was listening with the full, patient, non-judgmental attention that Thomas Carter brought to everything. And Clara was asking Hayes something quietly that made him smile, the real smile, the one she was still getting used to seeing. And Danny Reeves had not been invited, but had appeared anyway on the porch, visible through the window. And Hayes had seen him, and told Clara, and Clara had gone to the door and told him to come in, because Clara Hayes was her father's daughter in every way that mattered. Danny came in with his notebook in his shirt pocket, and the expression of a young man who has been given more than he expected and is trying not to show how much it means. She looked at all of them. She thought about what her father had written. "You found your place, Amelia." She had. She had found it in the most unlikely way, by the most unlikely road, delivered to exactly the right destination, by a man who hadn't had the courage or the decency to come to a train station himself, and had therefore accidentally, and without any intention of generosity, given her the greatest gift of her life. She did not thank Ethan Caldwell for this. Some gifts don't require gratitude toward the giver. They only require that you receive them fully and make something worthy of what they cost. Shadow stood in the far corral in the Montana evening, steady and unhurried. The horse nobody had been able to reach, the emblem of an impossible problem. Now simply an animal who had chosen the company of someone who chose him back. He was neither tamed nor broken. He was none of those diminishing things. He was himself, fully, freely, without apology. And Amelia Carter, who had arrived in Montana with 2 trunks and a heart that had been through the fire and had not, despite everything, stopped trusting the world enough to believe in it. Amelia Carter sat at the table in the house that had her name on its letterhead, and her father on one side, and her future on the other. And she thought, this is what it looks like when a person refuses to become the story someone else tried to write for them. She had written her own, and every word of it was true.